There's something hidden back here. Look at what I found in here.
On a gray September morning in Connecticut, Billionaire. Victoria Langford stood beside her infinity pool surrounded by executives, assistants, and the quiet hum of money, and laughed at a grease-stained mechanic crouching beside her broken Porsche. "Fix it," she said with a smirk sharp enough to cut glass, "and I'll marry you." The crowd laughed. The moment passed. Nobody thought twice. Nobody except Mason Cole. Because 30 seconds after opening that engine bay, he found something buried deep inside the machine that was about to bring down an empire. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the end. Because nothing about this is what you think it is. The drive from Stamford to the Langford estate took Mason Cole exactly 22 minutes on a good day, and this was not a good day. Traffic on I-95 was a slow crawl of brake lights and impatience, and his pickup, a 2004 Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it and a heating vent that rattled like a dying tambourine, sat among the luxury sedans and SUVs the way a paper cup sits beside crystal glasses. Technically doing the same job, not fooling anyone. Mason had the address written on a folded yellow notepad paper tucked into the cup holder. He didn't use GPS. It wasn't a philosophy or a statement. He just didn't trust the thing, since it sent him 40 minutes in the wrong direction outside of Providence 2 years ago, and he'd never quite forgiven it. He glanced at the notepad, turned left off the exit. The neighborhood changed fast. The streets got wider, the trees got taller. The houses stopped being houses and started being estates. The kind with names, with gated entries, with hedges trimmed to geometric perfection by crews who probably got paid more per hour than Mason charged for a full engine rebuild. He found the address, stopped at the gate. A voice came through the intercom before he even rolled his window down. Name and purpose of visit. Mason Cole. I'm here about the Porsche. A pause. Then the gate opened. The driveway alone was longer than Mason's entire block back in Stamford. He drove it slowly, not out of awe exactly, more like wariness. He'd worked on wealthy clients' cars before. Not this level of wealthy, but enough to know that money above a certain threshold didn't make people easier. It made them particular, impatient, certain that whatever went wrong was someone else's fault. He parked near the front steps and climbed out, pulling his worn canvas tool bag from behind the seat. A young woman in a blazer appeared at the door before he reached the top step. "Mr. Cole?" "Yeah." "Ms. Langford is waiting by the I'll take you through." She walked fast. Mason kept up. They moved through a foyer that was bigger than his apartment, past modern art that may or may not have meant something, through tall glass doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking a pool that had no business being that blue in September. Victoria Langford was standing at the far edge of the terrace with a coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other. She was talking to two men in suits, one of whom was laughing at something she'd just said. She didn't look up when Mason approached. Not right away. He waited. After about 15 seconds, she glanced over. "You're the mechanic." "Mason Cole," he said. "You called my shop. My assistant called your shop." She looked him over. The way people look over a contractor they're not sure they should have hired. Not rude exactly. Assessing. "I've had 3 specialists out here already. 2 from certified Porsche dealers in New York. One guy who supposedly wrote a book about vintage German imports. None of them could tell me what was wrong." "Where's the car?" She seemed mildly surprised he didn't offer any credentials in response. No reassurances, no sales pitch about his experience. "Around back," she said. "Thomas will show you." One of the men in suits, Thomas apparently, nodded and started walking. Mason followed. The garage was attached to the far end of the estate, and calling it a garage felt like calling the Louvre a storage unit. 6 bays, climate-controlled, lighting that belonged in a museum. 4 of the bays held various modern cars, 2 of which Mason recognized as being worth more than his house. The 5th bay held a covered shape that, even under its cloth wrap, had a silhouette Mason knew instantly. Thomas pulled back the cover. The 1973 Porsche 911 RS, Carrera white with the iconic black ducktail spoiler, sat there like something from another century. Which it was, technically. But more than the age, it was the presence, the way it occupied space, low and purposeful, and completely still in the way that only machines with real history manage to be still. Mason set his bag down on the workbench and walked around it once without touching it. Thomas cleared his throat. So the issue is, I'll look first, Mason said quietly. Then you can tell me what the others said. Thomas blinked, nodded, left him alone. Mason crouched beside the driver's side and looked at the rocker panels. He stood and examined the rear wheel arches. He ran his fingers along the seam between the rear lid and the body, feeling for inconsistencies the eye might miss. He checked the trunk. Empty, original liner intact. He looked at the VN plate, then at the numbers stamped into the body itself, making sure they matched. They did. So far, authentic. He moved to the engine bay. It was when he opened the rear lid and got his first proper look at the engine that something in his chest went very quiet. He didn't move for almost 10 seconds, because what he was looking at wasn't original, not completely. Nested between the correct external components, hidden behind restoration work. So meticulous it had fooled everyone who'd looked before him, was a specific mechanical configuration he had seen only twice in his life. A custom cooling modification, a hand-built oil routing adjustment, a particular approach to the throttle linkage that was essentially a signature, not written, not stamped, not documented anywhere in any official service manual. He'd seen it once in a car at a restoration workshop outside Stuttgart, and once in the car of the man who'd taught him everything, Karl Reinhardt. Mason stood up slowly and stared at the engine for a long moment. Karl, he thought, what were you doing inside this car? He didn't say anything when Thomas led him back out to the terrace. He didn't say anything when Victoria Langford looked up from her phone with that particular expression of someone who expected bad news and had already decided to be annoyed by it. She was surrounded by more people now, 4 or 5, all in the quiet business attire of people who lived in her orbit and were paid to stay in it. One of them was a man Mason hadn't seen before. Dark blazer, mid-40s, strong jaw, careful eyes. The kind of face that was always half smiling in a way that never reached all the way up. Well, Victoria said. Mason looked at her. I can fix it. Something passed across the assembled faces. Mild surprise. Maybe skepticism. The man with the careful eyes spoke first. The dealer's technician said the fuel system needed complete replacement. Parts alone would be, the fuel system's fine, Mason said. The man stopped. The carburetor was rejetted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and whoever looked at it last didn't recognize the configuration because it's not stock. Mason paused. It's better than stock. The car isn't broken. It's been modified by someone exceptional, and the people who came before me didn't know what they were looking at. Victoria studied him. And you do? I know who did the work. Or I know his method, which is the same thing. That wasn't entirely true. He knew the method. The rest of it he needed to think about carefully before saying out loud to anyone. Victoria tilted her head. Then, in the tone of someone making a dinner reservation rather than a significant statement, she said, Fix it, and I'll marry you. Laughter. Immediate, polite, reflexive. The kind of laughter that fills a space without thinking about it. Mason didn't laugh. I didn't look offended either. He just held her gaze for one beat longer than was comfortable, then looked back toward the garage. I'll need a few days, he said. And I work alone. I was back in his truck by noon. He sat in the driveway for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the notepad in the cup holder. He flipped it over and wrote 2 words on the back. Karl Reinhardt. Then he sat with the weight of that name and what it meant and what it might mean for the woman in that house. And after a while he started the engine and drove back toward Stamford, through the neighborhoods that shrank back to normal size, toward the school where Sophie was waiting. Sophie was 6 years old and deeply uninterested in being picked up from school quietly. She came out the front doors with her backpack straps loose and dangling, her yellow hair tie halfway out of her ponytail, holding a drawing she'd made that she immediately pressed against the truck window before Mason had even fully stopped. Dad, look. He leaned over and looked. It appeared to be either a horse or a very optimistic cat, possibly a motorcycle. What is it? It's our garage, she said, climbing in. That's you, that's me, and that's the car we're going to fix to be race car drivers. We're not going to be race car drivers. You don't know that. She buckled herself in with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it herself since she was 4, because she didn't like being helped, and immediately began eating the crackers from her lunchbox that she hadn't finished at school. Mason pulled out of the school lot. "Good day?" he asked. "Marcus said my drawing of the horse looked like a couch." "What'd you say?" "I said his face looked like a couch." She paused. "Mrs. Peterson said that was unkind." "It was a little unkind. He started it." Mason didn't say anything to that because honestly the logic was pretty solid for a 6-year-old. They drove in the comfortable noise of cracker eating and radio static, and Mason thought about the Porsche, and thought about Carl Reinhardt, and tried to figure out how to hold both of those things together without dropping one of them. The garage was on the ground floor of the building Mason owned, a narrow 2-story on the edge of a block that had been in the process of improving for about 5 years without ever quite getting there. The apartment above it was where he and Sophie lived. It was small and warm and full of her drawings and his technical manuals and a second-hand couch that had survived more things than either of them talked about. That night, after dinner and homework and the small negotiated drama of bedtime, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and opened his laptop. He searched for Carl Reinhardt. The results that came back were the same results they'd always been. The ones he'd looked at occasionally over the years, the way you sometimes press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. Carl Reinhardt, German automotive engineer, known for pioneering work in historic Porsche and BMW restoration throughout the 1980s and 90s. Died in a workshop fire outside Munich in 2009. Mason read that last part again. Died in a workshop fire. He'd been told that. He knew it intellectually. But some part of him had never fully integrated it, which was probably why he still searched the name sometimes. Because Carl had been the kind of man who seemed too large, too permanent, too relentlessly alive to have exited the world the way everything else did. Mason had been 23 when he went to Germany. A kid from Connecticut with a mechanic's certificate and a restlessness that hadn't known what to do with itself until he'd read about Carl's restoration workshop in a trade magazine and written a letter, an actual paper letter, because Carl didn't have email, asking to apprentice. He'd expected no response. Carl had responded in 3 days. "Come. We'll see if you're useful." That was it, the whole letter. Mason had laughed so hard he'd nearly fallen out of his chair. He spent 14 months in that workshop outside Stuttgart. He learned things about engines that he had no other way of learning. He learned that a machine with history was not the same as a machine that was old, that there was a difference between age and depth, between being worn down and being broken in. Carl taught in the way of someone who believed watching was better than explaining, and Mason had watched until his eyes hurt and his hands knew things his brain hadn't caught up to yet. And then Elena got sick, and Mason came home. He never went back. He never stopped being grateful for what those 14 months had built in him. But the grief of leaving, of coming back and watching Elena deteriorate and eventually lose her fight over 2 long years, leaving him alone with a daughter who'd just turned 2. That grief had settled over everything like a drop cloth, covering the version of himself that had existed in that workshop in Stuttgart. He'd become a different man, a good one, he hoped, a dependable one, a father, but different. He closed the laptop and looked out the window at the dark street. Carl Reinhardt's fingerprints were inside Victoria Langford's Porsche. That wasn't random. That wasn't coincidence. The question was what it meant, and who else knew about it. He started work on the Porsche the next morning. Victoria had arranged access, a key code for the side entrance to the garage, a brief text from her assistant explaining that the staff had been told to leave him alone. He arrived at 7:30 with his full kit and a second bag he didn't usually bring, containing instruments for documentation, calipers, a spectrometer, a camera. He was going to be thorough. The first day was all examination. He photographed everything. He measured clearances. He recorded what had been done to the car with the methodical patience of someone assembling evidence, which, he was beginning to suspect, was exactly what he was doing. Carl's modification was extraordinary. It shouldn't have worked the way it did, theoretically. The cooling adjustment in particular violated conventional approaches to airflow management in ways that bothered engineers who thought in straight lines. But Carl had never thought in straight lines. He'd thought in consequences, in downstream effects, in the way a change in one place created changes in 7 other places you hadn't anticipated yet. The result was an engine that ran cooler, cleaner, and more efficiently than anything the factory had produced. It was worth an enormous amount of money, not just for the performance, for the provenance, for the history. Mason photographed the modification and sent the images to no one. He sat with them himself first. Around noon, Victoria appeared. She came alone, which surprised him. She was in a dark sweater and jeans, hair down, no phone visible, which, based on what he'd seen the day before, felt significant. She stood in the garage doorway for a moment as if making sure she was allowed to enter her own space. "You actually came back," she said. "Said I would." She walked in slowly, looking at the documentation laid out on the workbench. The photographs, the notes, the careful record of what he'd found. "The other mechanics didn't take notes like this," she said. "The other mechanics weren't finding what I'm finding." She looked at him. "Which is?" Mason waited. He hadn't decided yet how much to say, or when. But there was something about the way she asked, not with the entitled impatience she'd shown the day before, but with something that sounded like genuine uncertainty, that shifted his calculation slightly. "Your car," he said carefully, "was worked on at some point by a man named Carl Reinhardt." Victoria didn't react with recognition, which told him something. "Who's that?" He was possibly the best automotive restoration engineer in Europe from the 80s through the early 2000s. He died in 2009. Mason paused. His work is extremely rare, and it increases the value of this car significantly. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "How significantly?" "Depends on documentation. With provenance verified, probably double what you think it's worth. Maybe more." She stared at the engine as if seeing it for the first time. "How did a car like this end up in my garage?" she said, not really to him, more to herself. "That," Mason said, "is a good question." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means someone who knows about this car and who knows what this modification is worth hasn't told you about it." He held her gaze. "And I'd want to know why." The second day, Mason arrived to find a man already in the garage. He was standing near the workbench looking at the photographs Mason had left there. Not touching them, just looking. Hands in his pockets, posture casual, like someone who had every right to be there and wanted to make sure you knew it. Mason recognized him from the terrace. The man with the careful eyes. "Mr. Cole," the man said, turning. He smiled. That same half-smile, warm on the surface and calibrated underneath. "I'm Damien Cross, Victoria's business partner. I hope you don't mind. I like to stay informed about things happening on the estate." "These are my notes," Mason said, "from my examination." "Of course." Damien nodded agreeably. "Just curious about the car. It's a beautiful machine. Victoria's had it for, 3 years now? I found it for her, actually. Tracked it down through a private collector in Geneva." Mason set his bag down. "Did you know about the modification?" "The modification?" Damien's expression stayed pleasant. "I know it had some custom work done. That was part of its appeal." "Did you know who did it?" "The collector mentioned a German specialist. I don't recall the name." He paused. "Should I?" Mason looked at him for a moment. Damien Cross was a good liar. The kind of liar who practiced by telling the truth in every way, except the one that mattered. "I'll need the provenance documentation," Mason said. "Whatever came with the car when Victoria acquired it." "I can look into that," Damien said easily. "I'd appreciate it." "Of course." Damien picked up his jacket from the back of a chair. He'd draped it there at some point, casual, like he owned the room, and moved toward the door. "Let me know if you need anything, Mr. Cole." He left. Mason stood in the silence of the garage and thought about the photographs on the workbench, in the careful ease of a man who was either exactly what he appeared to be, or something significantly more dangerous. He thought about Sophie eating crackers in the truck and laughing about couch faces. He photographed the documentation again, and this time sent the copies to his own encrypted email. All of it, every image. Then he got back to work. On the third day, Mason found the second thing. He had pulled the passenger side interior panel to inspect the chassis seam, which was a standard check on cars this age, looking for signs of welding repair that might indicate accident history. He wasn't expecting to find anything unusual. What he found instead, tucked behind the original sound-deadening material in a cavity near the B-pillar, was a small sealed envelope. It had been there long enough that the adhesive on the flap had dried and resealed naturally. The paper was yellowed at the edges. He held it for a long time without opening it. He was a mechanic, not a detective, not an investigator, not someone who had any particular authority to open sealed documents hidden inside a car that didn't belong to him. He set it on the workbench and photographed it first. Then he photographed the cavity it came from. Then he looked at it again. On the front, In handwriting he recognized with a jolt that hit somewhere below his sternum was a single line. For the person who finds what I've done here, you're better than you know. It was in German, but he'd learned to read German in 14 months in a workshop outside Stuttgart, and it translated itself in his head before he'd even finished reading it. Mason sat down on the shop stool and held the envelope in both hands and took a breath. Carl. He didn't open it. Not yet. Not in this garage, not alone, not without understanding more about what he was holding and why it was here and what it was going to cost someone when it came to light. He put it carefully in the inner pocket of his jacket. He worked for 3 more hours. He fixed what needed fixing. The real issues were subtle, related to the fuel delivery system interacting with Carl's modification in a way that required adjustment rather than replacement. An afternoon's careful work for someone who understood what they were looking at. He cleaned up at 6 and drove home through the gray Connecticut evening. Sophie was at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in. She looked up. "You smell like car," she announced. "I've been working on a car." "What kind?" "Old Porsche." Her eyes went wide with the particular reverence of a 6-year-old who had grown up in a garage. "Is it cool?" "It's very cool." "Can I see it?" "Maybe someday." He hung up his jacket carefully. The envelope was still in the inner pocket, and went to wash his hands. "What's the homework?" "Math, it's dumb." "Math isn't dumb. The problems are dumb. Listen." She read from her worksheet in a tone of practiced outrage. "Tommy has 6 apples and gives 3 to his friend. How many apples does Tommy have?" "Dad, why does Tommy keep giving away his apples? He's going to have no apples." "Maybe Tommy's generous. Maybe Tommy should think about his future." Mason dried his hands and came and sat across from her at the table. She was completely serious. He kept his face neutral with the effort of someone who had been doing this for years. 3, he said. "I know it's 3. I'm making a point." "Write down 3, Sophie." She wrote down 3 aggressively. They sat together at the table for a while, she doing math problems, he watching her with the quiet fullness that sometimes arrived unexpectedly. The feeling that despite everything, despite the grief and the years and the narrowed scope of the life he'd built, there were moments that were simply, uncomplicatedly good. Later, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of him. He opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, the paper soft with age. It was written in Carl's hand, the same cramped, particular script he remembered from workshop notes, from supply lists, from the margins of technical manuals that Carl had annotated with opinions and corrections, and the occasional expletive when a manufacturer had done something that offended him. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Because Carl Reinhardt had known, when he worked on that Porsche, that the car was being positioned as the centerpiece of a long financial fraud. He had written down what he suspected. He had hidden the note inside the car because he didn't trust the people around him, and he didn't have enough proof to go anywhere official yet. He had written down a name. The name was Damien Cross. Mason didn't sleep much that night. He lay in his bed with the ceiling above him and the envelope on the bedside table, and thought about the weight of what he was holding. Carl had suspected it 15 years ago, maybe more, had hidden the evidence inside the car with the patient confidence of a man who believed that eventually the right person would open the right engine bay. For the person who finds what I've done here. You're better than you know. He hadn't written it for Mason specifically. He couldn't have. But Mason was the person who'd found it, and now the question wasn't whether to do something with it. The question was how to do it without putting Sophie in the path of a man like Damien Cross. He thought about Victoria, standing in her garage in a dark sweater, asking how did a car like this end up here, in a voice that didn't sound like a billionaire asking a rhetorical question. It sounded like a woman who had started to suspect she didn't know the whole shape of her own life. She deserved to know. But he was going to be careful about how he told her, and when. And he was going to make sure that whatever happened next, he wasn't the one standing alone with it. The next morning, he arrived at the estate and found Victoria in the garage already. Again alone, again without the phone, which he was starting to understand was her version of being off the clock. She was looking at the Porsche the way you look at something you're reconsidering. "You said it's nearly done," she said. "Today or tomorrow?" She nodded. Was quiet for a moment. "You know, I meant what I said the other day, about the others not taking notes like you." "You didn't mean it as a compliment." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a wince. No, I meant it as I was noticing something. People here don't usually document things they find. They give me a summary, their version of what matters. She paused. You documented everything. It's important to have a record, Mason said carefully, especially with something valuable. She heard the weight under that. He could see it in the way she went still. How valuable, she said. He'd thought about this, about how to say it. Victoria, he said, using her first name for the first time. Before I answer that, I need to ask you something. The paperwork for this car, the provenance documents, the acquisition records. Who handled all of that when you bought it? She looked at him steadily. Damien did. Mason nodded once. Why? She said. Her voice had changed. Not scared exactly. More like someone who had picked up a sound they didn't like in the distance and was trying to determine if it was getting closer. I'd like you to have an attorney look at the provenance documents, Mason said. Not someone connected to your company, someone external, someone you trust personally. The silence in the garage was very complete. Tell me what you found, she said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He set Carl's letter on the workbench between them. I found this, he said, inside the car. She read it slowly. He watched her face move through things he couldn't name exactly. Recognition, calculation, a kind of controlled vertigo, like someone realizing the ground under their feet had been different than they believed for a very long time. When she looked up, her eyes were careful and clear. How did you know to trust this? She said. This letter, you don't know who Carl Reinhardt is. I do, actually, Mason said. I knew him. He trained me. I recognize his handwriting. Victoria stared at him. He's the one who taught you to read the modification, she said slowly. Yes. So he put the modification in the car, he hid a letter naming Damien, and then years later, the one person alive who'd recognize his work and his handwriting happened to show up to fix it. She paused. That's improbable, Mason said. I was going to say unsettling. That too. She looked down at the letter again. Damien's been my business partner for 7 years. Mason didn't say anything to that. He didn't have to. I need to make a call, she said. Her voice was steady, which he suspected cost her something. I know. She folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something you understand matters, and put it in her own pocket. She looked at Mason once more, a look that was assessing in a different way than it had been on that first morning. Less about whether he was competent, more about who he actually was. Thank you, she said. It came out simple and real, without the professional gloss of a woman who managed a billion-dollar empire. Then she walked out of the garage, phone already in hand. Mason turned back to the Porsche. He had an engine to finish. Outside, through the high garage windows, the gray Connecticut sky had shifted while they were talking. By the time he pulled on his gloves and leaned back into the engine bay, the first pale light of something better was pushing through the clouds. He noticed it. Then he got back to work. The attorney's name was Ruth Calloway, and she had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by people approximately 20 years ago. She was 61, sharp-eyed, and had spent 3 decades handling financial litigation in Connecticut and New York, the quiet, complicated kind that never made headlines because the people involved had too much to lose from headlines. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the habit of taking them off and holding them when she was thinking hard about something, which she did a great deal. Victoria had known her for 6 years, not through business, through her mother, who had used Ruth to handle a trust dispute when Victoria was in her mid-20s, before the money grew large enough that everything became complicated. Ruth was the one attorney Victoria could say with certainty had never had any contact with Damien Cross. She called her from the terrace, standing in the corner near the boxwood hedge where the wind came off the lawn, and made the call feel private even out in the open. Ruth picked up on the second ring. Victoria. Ruth, I need to talk to you. Not on the phone, in person, soon. A pause. Not a surprised pause. Ruth Calloway didn't pause out of surprise. How soon? Today, if possible. Come to my office at 4, Ruth said. I'll move something. That was it. No questions. No reassurances. Just the particular competence of someone who had heard enough urgent phone calls to know that asking for details in advance rarely helped. Victoria hung up and stood for a moment with her hand flat on the stone railing, looking out across the lawn toward the garage where she could hear, faintly, the sound of Mason working. The controlled, methodical sounds of someone who understood what they were doing with their hands. She thought about Carl Reinhardt's letter, still folded in her pocket. She thought about 7 years. 7 years of Damien sitting across from her at conference tables and dinners and board meetings. And she tried to recall a moment, any moment, where something had felt slightly off, where an answer had come too smoothly, where a number had shifted in a way she hadn't tracked carefully enough. The terrible thing was, she found several. She'd chosen not to look at them directly at the time. That was the part that sat in her stomach like something cold. She went inside to get ready for the 4 o'clock. She didn't tell Damien she was leaving. What? Ruth's office was in a converted brownstone in downtown Greenwich. No lobby, no receptionist at the front desk. Just a woman named Patricia who had been with her for 20 years and communicated primarily through a meaningful look and a cup of coffee placed in front of you before you sat down. Victoria sat in the leather chair across from Ruth's desk and put the letter on the desk between them. Ruth read it without touching it first, then picked it up carefully and read it again. Where did this come from? Inside the car, behind the interior panel. The mechanic found it. And you trust the mechanic? It wasn't quite a question. I didn't 3 days ago, Victoria said. I do now. He knew the man who wrote this. He trained under him. Ruth set the letter down. She took her reading glasses off and held them, which Victoria had learned meant she was working through something. The car was acquired through Damien Cross. Yes. So either Damien didn't know the letter was there, or he knew and chose to acquire the car anyway, which would mean he underestimated whether anyone would ever find it. Ruth paused. What do you know about the provenance documentation on the car? The acquisition records. Damien handled all of it. Ruth's expression didn't change, but something in it solidified. I want copies of everything, she said. Every document related to the acquisition. Don't ask Damien for them. Go to the source yourself. The seller, the transfer agent, the import paperwork. Tell your CFO you're doing a routine asset audit. My CFO reports to Damien. Then don't tell your CFO. Ruth put her glasses back on. Victoria, I need you to hear me clearly. If what this letter suggests is accurate, and if Damien Cross has been operating a fraud scheme inside your company, you are not looking at a business dispute. You're looking at federal crimes. Wire fraud, securities manipulation, potentially more. She paused. I can help you, but you cannot tip him off. Not a word, not a look, not a changed behavior. As far as Damien Cross is concerned, nothing is different. Victoria looked at her steadily. I understand. Does the mechanic understand? He found this letter. He may be in a vulnerable position. Victoria thought about Mason, about the way he'd put the letter on the workbench between them and waited for her to process it without rushing her toward a conclusion. About the quiet seriousness of a man who had brought her evidence of something that could have been none of his business and chosen to make it his business anyway. He understands more than most people would, she said. Ruth nodded once. I'll start making calls. Mason finished the Porsche on a Thursday. He spent the last morning doing the final calibration with the care of someone signing their name to something that would outlast them, adjusting the fuel delivery against Carl's modified cooling system until the two worked in harmony, the way the original engineer had intended, not correcting Carl's work, but completing the conversation between it and the rest of the machine. It was delicate. It took 4 hours. When he was done, he sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound was extraordinary. It wasn't loud the way people expected old sports cars to be loud. Coarse and aggressive and fighting against itself. This was something else. Layered and purposeful. A mechanical voice that had been tuned by someone who understood the difference between power and brutality. The whole car vibrated with it in a way that felt almost respiratory, like it was breathing. Mason sat with it for 30 seconds, listening. Then he got out and went to find Victoria. She was in her study on the second floor. He'd been let in by Thomas, who had stopped looking at him with quite the same skepticism he'd had on the first day. Victoria was on a call when Mason appeared in the doorway. She saw him and held up one finger, finished the sentence she was on, and hung up. It's done, she said. Come hear it. She followed him to the garage without stopping for a jacket, which he noticed because it was October in Connecticut and 45 degrees, which meant she was either genuinely curious or genuinely unsettled enough that the cold wasn't registering. When she heard the engine running from 15 feet away, she stopped walking. Mason watched her face. The Porsche was idling with the garage doors open, the sound carrying out into the cool morning. Victoria stood and listened to it the way you listen to something you didn't expect to be moved by. Her arms were crossed, partly cold, partly something else. That's what it's supposed to sound like? She asked. That's what it was always supposed to sound like, Mason said. Nobody had unlocked it. She looked at the car for a long moment. Then she turned to Mason and said, "Do you want to come with me when I take it out?" He hadn't expected that. He thought for a second. "Yeah," he said. "All right, well." She drove it the way someone drives something they're figuring out in real time. Careful at first, reading the responses, getting a feel for where the weight sat and how it communicated through the steering. They took the back roads north of the estate, the ones that wound through the hills where the October trees were burning orange and yellow, and the light through them cut in long angles across the road. After about 10 minutes, she settled into it. You could feel the change. She stopped fighting the car and started talking to it, the small corrections becoming instinctive. Mason sat in the passenger seat with his knees slightly bent because the footwell was tight and watched the road and said nothing. Victoria said, after a while, "Ruth wants forensic accountants." "Good. She thinks this is bigger than the car." "I think that too." She took a curve with confidence that wasn't there 10 minutes ago. The engine sang through it. "How long do you think he's been doing it?" she said. Mason considered. The letter's at least 10 years old based on the paper. Probably older. The car was already in the system when Carl worked on it. He paused. Long enough that it's not opportunistic. It was designed. She didn't say anything to that for a while. The trees moved past them, and the road dipped down toward a valley, and the car handled the descent with a sureness that felt almost reassuring. "I keep going back to why he'd keep the car on the estate," she said. "If it was evidence, why not get rid of it? Because getting rid of it would mean explaining to you why the car you liked was suddenly gone. And because—" Mason paused. He probably didn't know about Carl's work, or didn't understand what it meant. Carl was secretive. He didn't document his modifications in any standard way. Damien may have known the car was tied to the scheme without knowing someone had left a record inside it. So the letter was just sitting there. For years, she shook her head once. Not dramatically, just a small, private movement of someone accepting something that didn't get easier for being accepted. They drove for another 20 minutes without much more conversation, and when she pulled back through the estate gates, the car was warm and performing exactly as it should, and neither of them mentioned the fact that it was the last time Mason would have a reason to come back to this garage. He sent his invoice that afternoon from his truck in the driveway. Fair rate, clearly itemized. He'd thought about undercharging, the way you sometimes feel weird billing for something that turned into more than a job. Then he decided against it. He'd done the work. He'd send a fair invoice. He drove home. Sophie had a half day at school, some kind of teacher professional development thing, and his neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, had picked her up, so Sophie was at the apartment when he got back, sitting on the couch with Mrs. Kowalski eating toast and watching an animated movie about a robot who wanted to be a chef, or possibly a chef, who wanted to be a robot. The premise had been explained to Mason 3 times, and he still wasn't certain. "Dad's home," Sophie announced without looking up from the screen. "How was the car?" Mrs. Kowalski asked. She was 72, Polish-born, and had been looking after Sophie on and off since she was 3. She had no filter whatsoever and considered this a feature. "Good," Mason said. "It's done." "You were gone 4 days for a car." "It was a complicated car." "You always say that." She handed him a piece of toast that he hadn't asked for. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You look tired and you have something on your mind. The two go together." She stood up and collected her coat. Sophie ate. There's soup on the stove. She left with the ease of someone who had said everything she intended to say. Mason sat on the couch next to Sophie, who immediately leaned against his arm with the unself-conscious weight of a child who assumes the people they love will always be there to lean on. He put his arm around her. On the screen, the robot chef was having some kind of identity crisis. "Dad," Sophie said. "Is the Porsche lady nice?" He thought about it. "She's getting there." Sophie seemed to consider this a satisfactory answer. She went back to the movie. Mason sat with the soup going cold on the counter and his daughter warm against his side in the complicated weight of a week that had turned into something he hadn't signed up for, and thought about what came next. He'd done his part. He'd found the letter. He'd told Victoria. He'd pointed her toward an attorney. Whatever happened now was in other hands. That was the right answer. He was fairly sure of that. I was in the garage 2 days later working on a 2009 BMW that needed a timing chain, bread and butter work, the kind that paid the lease and the utilities and Sophie's school supplies. When his phone rang with an unknown number, he almost didn't answer it. "Cole," he said. "Mr. Cole." A woman's voice, professional, precise. "This is Ruth Calloway. I'm Victoria Langford's attorney. I believe you found a letter in her car last week." "I did. I need to ask you some questions, if you have time, specifically about Carl Reinhardt and your time with him, and about your assessment of what you found in the vehicle." She paused briefly. "I want to be clear that this is in connection with a legal matter and that your cooperation is voluntary. However, it could be significantly valuable." Mason set down the wrench he'd been holding. "How significantly?" he said. "There may be federal charges filed. The letter you found and the provenance of Carl Reinhardt's work inside the car are potentially important to establishing timeline and intent." Another pause. "You'd be a fact witness, not a party, but I'd want to prep you properly." He thought about it for maybe 4 seconds. "When?" he said. "What?" Ruth Calloway's office felt different the second time. Not because anything had changed in it, the same worn leather chairs, the same Patricia with the coffee, but because the first time Mason had been a name Victoria mentioned. Now he was someone Ruth had read about, knew the basic outline of, and was looking at with the focused attention of someone deciding how much weight to put on a piece of evidence. She asked good questions. Not leading ones, open ones, the kind that let a person tell their story in the order it naturally came out. She asked about Carl, about Stuttgart, about what the modification signified in terms of rarity and value. She asked about the letter, and about the handwriting, and about how he could be certain. He answered each one carefully, the way he approached an engine, checking each component before connecting it to the next. When he was done, she took her glasses off and held them. "You understand," she said, "that your testimony about the handwriting could be challenged. You're not a forensic document examiner." "I know. We'd want to bring in one. But your corroboration is valuable because you have direct knowledge of Reinhardt's work and can speak to the modification itself as proof of his involvement." She paused. "The modification is arguably more important than the letter. The letter can be questioned. What's inside that engine is harder to dispute." "Have the forensic accountants started?" Ruth looked at him, not surprised he was asking, more considering how much to share. "They started Monday," she said. "What they're finding is significant." She left it there. Mason nodded. He drove home thinking about Damien Cross standing in the garage with his hands in his pockets, looking at photographs. The practiced ease of it. The careful smile. He thought about the question Victoria had asked in the car. Why would he keep it on the estate? And a different answer occurred to him now, one that hadn't surfaced before. Not because Damien didn't know about the letter, but because moving the car would mean letting go of an asset he planned to eventually acquire through the financial mechanisms he was building. The car was part of the scheme. The car was supposed to end up in Damien's hands, not through theft, but through a series of corporate maneuvers that would make it look like a clean transaction. He'd been patient. He'd been building something long-term. Mason wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Worse, he decided. It was definitely worse. 3 weeks passed. The BMW got fixed. A '67 Mustang came in needing a full brake system overhaul. A good job, 2 days of work. Satisfying in the methodical way that brake systems were satisfying because the margin for imprecision was exactly 0, and that focused the mind wonderfully. An older man named Gerald brought in a '91 Honda Accord that he'd driven for 30 years and wanted kept running for 30 more. And Mason liked Gerald and liked the Honda, and spent a morning going over it with the care you'd give a patient who'd taken good care of themselves and deserved the same in return. Normal work. Normal days. Sophie lost her second tooth and spent approximately 48 hours performing the gap for anyone who would pay attention, which was mostly Mason and Mrs. Kowalski and the cashier at the grocery store who had not asked but was polite about it. Mason cooked dinner most nights. He helped with homework. He picked her up from school and dropped her off and had the familiar small arguments about bedtime and screen time and whether toast counted as a dinner, which it did not. And Sophie's counter-argument, which was that it was warm bread with butter and what was pasta if not that. And it was a better argument than it should have been. He heard nothing from Victoria. He hadn't expected to. She had an attorney, she had accountants, she had a problem to dismantle. She didn't need a mechanic for any of that. He'd been useful for a specific thing at a specific time, and that was fine. That was how most jobs ended. He told himself that several times, in the offhand way you tell yourself things that are true, but that you're checking on. And then, on a Tuesday evening in late October, he got a text from an unsaved number that said, "The forensic team found it. All of it. Ruth says it's enough." He read it twice, then he typed back, "Good." He stared at the screen for a moment longer. Then he added, "How are you?" The reply came 3 minutes later. "Honestly, I don't know yet. Still figuring that out." He put the phone down and went to stir whatever was on the stove, which was a vegetable soup that he'd started too late and was going to be slightly undercooked and honestly fine. Still figuring that out. He understood that answer completely. The first time Damien Cross's name appeared in a news article, it was a small item in a financial trade publication. An alert about a Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry into a mid-sized Connecticut investment firm. No names in the headline. Mason found it by accident, searching for something else entirely on his phone while waiting for Sophie's dentist appointment to end. He read it standing in a beige waiting room with a foam model tooth on the counter and a fish tank gurgling in the corner, and the clinical normalcy of his surroundings made the information feel slightly unreal. The quiet unraveling of something that had been built carefully over years, reduced to 3 paragraphs in a trade publication that most people would scroll past without stopping. Sophie came out 20 minutes later with a sticker on her shirt, a cartoon tooth with sunglasses, and informed him that the dentist said her permanent teeth were coming in excellently, which she said with the gravity of someone who had received significant medical news. "That's great, Soph." She said my molars were very promising. High praise. "I know." She took his hand as they walked out. "Dad, can we get hot chocolate?" They got hot chocolate. Life continued at its own pace, indifferent to the legal machinery grinding forward somewhere in federal offices and conference rooms, and the private practices of attorneys who billed by the hour and knew where the bodies were buried. It was Victoria who called him. Not a text, an actual phone call, on a Friday afternoon when Mason was under a car and had to slide out and wipe his hands to answer it. He almost missed it. "Victoria." "Hi." Her voice was different from the terrace voice, different from the car voice. More tired, more plain. "I wanted to call. I know I've been—" A pause. "There's been a lot happening." "I know. I saw the trade publication. That's nothing yet compared to what's coming." She exhaled. "Ruth is filing a formal complaint with the SEC on Monday. The federal prosecutors already have the accountant's report. They'll move fast after that." "Are you okay?" The question came out more direct than he intended. He heard a brief silence on the other end. "I had a board meeting yesterday," she said. 12 people in a room, half of whom have known Damien longer than they've known me, and I had to sit there and present the findings and watch their faces do that thing where they're trying to decide if they should have seen it coming." She paused. "I keep thinking about 7 years of trusting someone, and at no point did I—" She stopped, started again differently. "You asked me that first week. You asked why he'd keep the car on the estate. And you had the right instinct before I did. You'd known him for 20 minutes. I just knew what I was looking for," Mason said. "No," she said. "You were paying attention. That's different." He leaned against the side of the car and looked at the fluorescent strip lighting on the garage ceiling and thought about how to answer that. "You built something real," he said finally. "Whatever Damien was doing around it, underneath it, you built a real company. That doesn't come from someone who wasn't paying attention. It comes from someone who trusted the wrong person. Those aren't the same thing." Silence on the other end. Long enough that he thought the call had dropped. "That's—" She cleared her throat. "Thank you for saying that. I mean it." "I know you do." Another pause, different this time. "How's Sophie?" The shift surprised him. He smiled despite himself. "Her dentist says her molars are very promising," he said. A sound came through the phone that was definitely a laugh. Short, surprised, real. Not the managed kind he'd heard on the terrace the first day. "That's very good news," she said. "She agrees." They talked for a few more minutes. About nothing particularly significant. About the car. About how it was running. About Ruth and the timeline. Easy conversation, the kind that didn't have an agenda. When they hung up, Mason stood for a moment in his quiet garage with the phone in his hand and the late afternoon light coming through the high windows, and registered the feeling of having talked to someone who hadn't asked him to be anything except himself. He went back under the car. The day the federal investigation became public was a Wednesday. Mason was dropping Sophie off at school when the news alerts started coming through on his phone. He'd set one for Damien Cross's name after the trade publication piece, a habit of someone who liked to know what was moving before it arrived. He read the first alert in the school parking lot after watching Sophie disappear through the front doors, backpack swinging, already talking to a friend before she was 5 steps from the car. The charges were significant: securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, a scheme dating back 11 years, involving the systematic manipulation of asset valuations, the fabrication of investment returns, and the movement of funds through a network of shell corporations in 3 countries. And among the specific pieces of evidence cited, the provenance records of a 1973 Porsche 911 RS. Mason put the phone in his pocket and sat in the parking lot for a while. I thought about Carl Reinhardt, who had seen something wrong and hidden evidence inside a car because he didn't know what else to do with it, and who had died in 2009 never knowing if anyone would find it. He thought about the letter. For the person who finds what I've done here, you're better than you know. I thought it was a strange and circuitous route for justice to take, through a dead man's hands and a modified engine and a crumbling notepad address and a drive through October Hills in a car that finally sounded the way it was supposed to. But it had taken the route it needed to take. He drove back to the garage and opened the bay doors and got to work. 4 days later, Damien Cross showed up. Mason was alone. Sophie was in school, the garage was empty, except for a '98 Subaru that needed head gaskets and wasn't going anywhere fast. He heard tires on the gravel, looked out, and recognized the car. Dark sedan, recent model. He'd seen it in Victoria's driveway. He didn't stop what he was doing. Damien walked in wearing a coat that probably cost more than Mason's truck, hands visible, no particular body language of aggression. Just the careful ease, the practiced steadiness of a man who believed that composure was a form of power. Mr. Cole. He looked around the garage. Nice place. Mason set down his torque wrench. He didn't say anything. Damien smiled. I wanted to have a conversation, off the record, man to man. There's nothing to have a conversation about, Mason said. I disagree. Damien moved slightly, not toward Mason, just a shift that changed the geometry of the room in a small way. You found something in a car. You gave it to someone who didn't understand the context. I understand the instinct. You were trying to do the right thing. His voice was measured, almost warm. The problem is that what you found was part of something complicated, something with a lot of moving pieces, and a letter written by a man who didn't have all the information isn't exactly... Damien! Mason's voice came out flat. I know what you're doing. The smile stayed. You've got a daughter, Damien said. What, 6 years old? The room changed temperature. Mason didn't move. He stood very still and felt something settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that. Something older and harder. The stillness of a person who has decided something and finished deciding it. You need to leave, he said. I'm just saying, I heard what you were saying. Mason looked at him steadily. And I'm going to tell you clearly. You need to leave this garage right now, and you need to never come back, and you need to never say my daughter's name again. Damien's smile thinned. You should think very carefully, he said. I have, Mason said. Leave. For a long moment, the garage was completely quiet. The Subaru ticked as the engine cooled. Outside, a car passed on the street. Then Damien Cross turned, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked out. Mason stood in the middle of the garage floor and breathed. Then he picked up his phone and called Ruth Calloway. He came to my shop, he said when she answered. He mentioned Sophie. Ruth's voice went very precise. Did he threaten her directly? Indirectly, clearly. Stay there. Don't call anyone else. I'm calling the U.S. Attorney's office in the next 60 seconds. She hung up. Mason stood in the garage looking at the empty doorway where Damien Cross had been standing and thought about Carl Reinhardt and about evidence that waits patiently for the right moment, and about the particular stupidity of a man who had survived 11 years of fraud only to threaten a 6-year-old girl 48 hours after federal charges were filed. That was the moment the case stopped being something Mason had observed from the edge of. That was the moment it became his. Ruth Calloway moved fast. By the time Mason had made a second cup of coffee he hadn't asked for and was standing in his garage doorway watching the street, two things had happened. Ruth had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had contacted the lead federal prosecutor on the Cross case, a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Marsh, who apparently had been waiting for exactly this kind of development with the focused patience of someone who had built a careful case and knew that people like Damian Cross eventually made the mistake of believing they were untouchable. Ruth called back in 40 minutes. "The threat against your daughter constitutes witness tampering and obstruction of justice," she said, without preamble. "Marsh wants a recorded statement from you today if possible. Can you come to my office at 2? Mason looked at the Subaru. The head gaskets weren't going anywhere. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that. Bring anything you have, notes, photographs, anything from your time at the estate. I have the original documentation from my examination. I kept copies." A brief pause. "Of course you did." There was something in her voice that wasn't quite approval, more like the recognition of a person who had encountered, finally, someone who did things the way she'd always believed they should be done. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." He wasn't late. He sat in Ruth's office across from Diane Marsh, who was 47, wore her hair in a practical knot, and had the kind of eyes that logged everything without telegraphing it. She had a legal pad and a pen and a small recorder on the desk between them, and she asked her questions with the precision of someone who had done this many times and understood that the quality of a witness statement had everything to do with how the questions were structured. She asked Mason to walk through the entire sequence, from the first phone call to his shop, through every day at the estate, through finding the letter, through his conversation with Victoria, through Damian's appearance in the garage that morning. She asked follow-up questions when she needed them. She let him talk when he was building towards something. At no point did she lead him. When he described the modification, Carl's work, the specific configuration, what it meant in terms of provenance and value, she leaned forward slightly. "And you can identify this modification as definitively the work of Carl Reinhardt?" she said. "I can say I've seen this exact configuration in 2 places in my life," Mason said. "Once in a car in Carl's workshop in Stuttgart, and once in Victoria Langford's Porsche. The probability of 2 people independently arriving at this specific combination of modifications is what... It's not realistic. This is a signature. It's as identifiable as handwriting." And the letter. In his handwriting, which I recognize from 14 months of working alongside him. He paused. "I understand I'm not a document examiner, but the modification and the letter together, one corroborates the other. If you verify the handwriting independently, the modification confirms it. If someone disputes the modification, the letter establishes context." Marsh looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Cole," she said, "have you done this before? Testified in any legal capacity?" "No." "You present well for someone who hasn't." "I'm just telling you what I found," he said. She made a note. "The threat this morning. Walk me through it again." His exact words. Mason did. He kept it clean, not editorializing, not expanding beyond what was actually said. Just the sequence. What Damian said and how he said it, and in what order. When he finished, Marsh sat back slightly and looked at her legal pad. "The mention of your daughter's age," she said. "He said 6 years old specifically?" "Yes." "Not your daughter, 6 years old." "Correct." She wrote something down. "That's not an accident," she said, more to herself than to him. Then she looked up. "I want to be transparent with you about where this goes. The original charges against Cross are significant. We're confident in them. Your testimony about the Porsche and the letter strengthens the timeline and establishes intent. The threat this morning is an additional charge, and it's significant because it demonstrates consciousness of guilt. Someone who is innocent doesn't drive to a mechanic's shop to intimidate him." She paused. "It also tells us something about his state of mind right now. He's scared. Scared people make poor decisions. That's generally good for us." Mason nodded. "Are you concerned for your daughter's safety?" Marsh asked. It was a practical question, not a sympathetic one which somehow made it easier to answer. He thought about it honestly. "I'm alert," he said. "I don't know if concerned is the right word yet. We can discuss protective measures if you want them." "Let me think about it." She nodded. Think fast. We're moving on the additional charges by end of week. He picked Sophie up from school that afternoon and didn't tell her anything except that they were going to Mrs. Kowalski's for dinner, which Sophie received as good news because Mrs. Kowalski made pierogi from scratch, and Sophie treated this as one of the fundamental good things in life. They walked the 2 blocks to Mrs. Kowalski's apartment, and Sophie held his hand and talked without stopping about a disagreement at recess involving a disputed rule in a jump rope game, the details of which were genuinely complicated and involved 3 separate conflicting accounts of what the original rule had been. And Mason listened and asked the right questions and thought, underneath all of it, about Damien Cross knowing his daughter was 6 years old. Mrs. Kowalski opened the door before they knocked. I heard you on the stairs, she said. Sophie, wash your hands. Mason, sit. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. He sat. She put coffee in front of him and went back to the stove and said, without turning around, something happened today. Why do you think that? Because you're holding Sophie's hand like you're worried she'll disappear. She stirred something. What happened? He considered how much to say. Mrs. Kowalski was not a woman who panicked, and she was not a woman who repeated things. She had been a consistent presence in Sophie's life for 4 years, and she deserved to know when that presence might need to be more careful. The case I got mixed up in, he said. The person at the center of it came to the shop today. Said some things he shouldn't have said. She turned from the stove and looked at him. About Sophie? Adjacent to Sophie. Her face went through something complicated and arrived at a controlled stillness. Is she in danger? I don't think so. I've talked to the federal prosecutors. They're moving on it. But I wanted you to know, if I ask you to pick her up somewhere specific, or if anything feels off to you at any point, you call me immediately, obviously. She said it the way she said most things, like the answer had been evident from the beginning, and she was mildly offended by the suggestion it needed to be stated. Then she sat down across from him and lowered her voice. You did the right thing, getting involved. I know you didn't want to. I didn't have a choice, he said. Everyone has a choice. You just made the right one. She stood back up. Now eat something. You look like you haven't eaten today. He hadn't, actually. The federal prosecutors filed the additional charges, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, on a Friday morning. Mason learned about it from Ruth, who called him at 8 a.m. while he was making Sophie's lunch. It's done, she said. The judge is reviewing the bail conditions. Marsh expects them to be significantly tightened. At minimum, Cross will be prohibited from any contact with you, Sophie, Victoria, or any witness in the case. Good. There may be a bail revocation hearing. His attorneys will fight it, but the transcript of your statement is pretty unambiguous. A pause. How are you holding up? Fine, he said. She let that sit for a moment, the way experienced people let obviously incomplete answers sit. I mean it, he said. All right. She didn't push. Ruth Calloway's advice, which you didn't ask for but you're getting, keep your routine. Go to work, pick up your daughter. Don't change your behavior in ways that make it obvious you're rattled. The worst thing you can do right now is become unpredictable. I'm not rattled. I know, she said. I'm telling you anyway. I'm at Sophie's lunch, cheese sandwich, apple slices, the small bag of crackers she insisted on, even though she never finished them, and drove her to school. Normal morning, normal drive. He watched her go through the front doors and then sat in the parking lot for a moment longer than usual, watching the other parents and kids and the ordinary movement of an ordinary Tuesday morning, and let it settle around him. Then he drove to work. Victoria called that afternoon. I heard about the tampering charges, she said. Her voice was careful, but not quite steady. Mason, I'm sorry, I should have... You don't need to apologize, he said. He went to your shop. He mentioned Sophie. Her voice tightened on the last word. He knew she was 6. That means he looked into you. He looked into your family. I know. That's because of me. Because of the car. Because of Victoria. He said her name the way he'd said it in the garage that first week. Not sharply, just clearly, enough to stop the spiral. He looked into me because I found evidence of what he did. That's not your fault. That's his. Stop building a case against yourself. Silence. You're very straightforward, she said finally. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. A pause. I'm having a hard time. I don't I know that sounds strange, given everything. The company's fine, structurally. Ruth says the legal exposure is mostly on Damien personally, less on the firm itself. But I keep finding these moments, decisions I made over 7 years that I'm now re-examining. She exhaled. It's exhausting. That sounds about right, Mason said. You've done that? Re-examined things? He thought about Elena, about coming home from Stuttgart and watching her get sick by increments and making decisions in that period that he still occasionally turned over in his mind. Whether he'd been present enough, whether he'd missed things, whether he'd made her feel alone in it, even when he was in the room. Yeah, he said, I've done that. Does it stop? Not completely, he said honestly, but it gets quieter. And at some point you figure out which parts are worth learning from and which parts are just punishment. And you try to keep the first kind and let go of the second. Another silence, but a different quality than the first one. Softer. That's good advice, she said. Took me a few years to get there. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. I should let you get back to work. It's fine. And it was. The Subaru was done. The afternoon was quiet. Are you eating? Sleeping? Reasonably. That's a lawyer answer. Maybe I've been spending too much time with Ruth. But she was smiling when she said it. He could hear it. They talked for another 10 minutes. Nothing urgent. The kind of conversation that happens between people who have been through something together and are figuring out what they are to each other on the other side of it. When they hung up, Mason sat at his workbench for a while and looked at the garage that was his and the light coming through the side windows and thought about how much had shifted in the past month without any of it announcing itself. The bail revocation hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in federal court in New Haven. Mason wasn't required to attend. His statement was already in the record. But Ruth told him about it, and he found the night before that he couldn't quite settle. He sat at the kitchen table after Sophie was asleep and worked through a set of calculations for a customer's engine rebuild that he'd been putting off. The math was straightforward. He'd done hundreds of these, but his mind kept cycling back to the hearing room he'd never seen, to a judge he didn't know, to a process that was now running on its own momentum regardless of what Mason Cole did in his kitchen on a Wednesday night. He'd done his part. He kept coming back to that. Carl had done his part too. Hidden the letter, trusted that the car would eventually reach the right hands. And it had, after 10 years and a fire and a dead man and a fraudster who'd been clever enough to hide for over a decade. That was how long it took sometimes. Justice wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. It moved at the speed of bureaucracy and legal procedure and the particular patience of people who built cases carefully because they knew a sloppy case was no case at all. He closed the laptop and went to look in on Sophie. She was asleep with one arm around a stuffed elephant she'd named Gerald, which he found quietly funny because he'd never mentioned the Honda Accord owner to her, and Gerald was an excellent name for both an elephant and a man who'd driven a 1991 Accord for 30 years. He stood in the doorway for a minute. Then he went to bed. The hearing went the way Diane Marsh had predicted. Ruth called him at noon on Thursday. Bail revoked. Cross is remanded pending trial. His attorneys argued it was an innocent visit, that there was no explicit threat. The judge didn't buy it. The transcript was clear enough. A pause. He won't be going anywhere for a while. Mason was in the middle of a brake job. He set down the caliper. Okay, he said. That's it? Okay? What else should I say? Ruth made a small sound that might have been amusement. Most people would say something more expressive. I'm glad, he said. Is that better? Marginally, but her voice had warmth in it. You'll be called to testify at trial. We're looking at a trial date sometime in the spring, depending on how his defense team plays it. They may push for a plea arrangement before it gets there, but Marsh thinks it's likely. Either way, I'll keep you informed. Thanks, Ruth. Thank you, Mr. Cole, for finding that letter, for keeping documentation, for calling me immediately when he came to your shop. She paused. Carl Reinhardt trained someone well. He didn't answer right away. He did, he said finally. He went back to the brakes, hushed him. November arrived with the particular bluntness of New England. One week it was autumn, the next it was gray and cold, and the leaves were gone, and the sky sat low over everything like a ceiling that needed painting. Mason put the winter tires on the truck. He bought Sophie a heavier coat she immediately declared was too puffy, and then wore every single day. He fixed a Volvo, 2 Toyotas, and a 1969 Chevelle that came to him from a retired firefighter in Norwalk, who'd been rebuilding it for 6 years and needed a second opinion on the carburation. The Chevelle took 4 days and was enormously satisfying. Victoria came by the garage for the first time on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of November. She didn't announce it. He heard a car he didn't recognize pull up and looked out to see her climbing out of a dark green Range Rover, wearing a coat that was practical rather than designed, and carrying 2 coffees from the place 2 blocks away. He slid out from under the Chevelle. "You found the garage," he said. "You're in the phone book." She looked at the Chevelle. "That's beautiful." "It will be." She handed him a coffee and looked around, at the bay, at the workbench with its organized tools, at the framed technical diagram on the wall that Sophie had colored on the edges of when she was 4, and that Mason had never replaced because the crayon marks were in the corners and didn't interfere with anything important. "Is this where you live upstairs?" "Yeah," she nodded, taking it in without the evaluation of someone measuring square footage or assessing value. More like someone who was reading the character of a place. "It suits you," she said. He leaned against the workbench and drank the coffee, which was good. She'd gotten the order right without asking, which meant she'd paid attention to something at some point that he didn't remember sharing. Black, no sugar. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Better," she said. And it sounded true, not polished. "The company is stabilizing. I've been very honest with the board about everything. More transparent than I probably needed to be legally, but I think they needed to see that I wasn't going to manage this from behind a statement." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "Some of them are still deciding how they feel about me. That's fine. I'm deciding some things about them too." "That's fair. I've also been thinking about the car." She looked up. "Carl's modification. Ruth said once the case is resolved, the provenance can be formally documented. The car's value officially doubles at least," Mason said. "Probably more. Carl's authenticated restorations are extraordinarily rare. There are only a handful of verified examples. If this is formally documented and connected to him, the collectors who care about that history will care about it a great deal." "I don't care about what it's worth," she said. It came out simply, not like a performance of not caring about money. I care in a practical sense. It affects the asset records. But that's not what I mean." She paused. "I keep thinking about the fact that he put his best work into a car that was being used in a fraud, that he knew something was wrong and he couldn't stop it, but he could. Leave his mark in it, leave evidence. Like he was making sure the car couldn't be fully corrupted by what was happening around it." Mason looked at her. He hadn't thought about it quite that way. But she wasn't wrong. "He was stubborn," he said. "Carl. He believed in the integrity of the work itself, separate from everything else. Like the quality of what you made was its own kind of argument." He paused. "He used to say that a machine built honestly tells the truth eventually. I thought he was being philosophical. Maybe he was being literal." Victoria was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in her hands. "I'd like to learn about him," she said. "If that's all right. Not for the case. Ruth has everything she needs. But he's inside my car. He put something true in it. I'd like to know who he was." Mason nodded slowly. "I can tell you what I know." "Would you want to do that somewhere that isn't a garage, at some point?" She said it carefully, the question balanced precisely between personal and professional. "I was thinking dinner, if Sophie's okay with Mrs. Kowalski." He looked at her. She met his eyes with the directness he'd come to recognize as just how she was when she wasn't performing the billionaire. Not calculating, just honest. "Yeah," he said. "I think that could work." He didn't overthink it, or he tried not to. He told himself it was 2 people who'd been through something together and were finding out whether that something was a conclusion or a beginning. He'd had exactly one relationship since Elena, a woman named Dana he'd met at Sophie's preschool pickup 2 years ago, kind and careful, and entirely wrong for him in ways that took them 8 months to figure out. The ending had been gentle and sad, in the way of things that fail not from fault, but from fundamental mismatch, and he'd filed it away as evidence that he was probably better at understanding engines than people. He mentioned dinner to Sophie casually while she was eating breakfast on a Saturday. "The lady with the Porsche?" she said immediately. "Yeah." Sophie chewed her toast and considered this with the gravity of someone whose opinion was being solicited, which it was not, but whose opinion was coming regardless. "She seemed nice," Sophie said. You've never met her. You talk about her like she's nice. She took another bite. Also, Mrs. Kowalski said she seems nice. Mason looked at her. Mrs. Kowalski has never met her either. Mrs. Kowalski knows things. Sophie said this with complete confidence and went back to her toast. He went to pick up the newspaper from the front step and stood outside in the cold gray morning for a moment, and did not think about Elena, and did not make it into something larger than it was, and mostly succeeded at both. The dinner was at a restaurant in Greenwich that was good without being performative about it, a small Italian place on a side street that Victoria had chosen, which told him something about her sense of what a meal was for. Not to impress, just to eat and talk somewhere comfortable. She was there when he arrived, which he appreciated. He'd half expected to walk into the practice tableau of a woman who arrived late to establish something. She was already at the table with a glass of wine and her coat on the back of the chair and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, reading something on her phone that she put away immediately when she saw him. Hi, she said. Hi. He sat. They ordered without performing the menu at each other, which was the first comfortable thing. She asked him about Stuttgart first, not because it was on the official agenda, but because she'd been thinking about it since the garage conversation, and the directness with which she asked it told him she was someone who thought about things between conversations and came back to them rather than making small talk as a preamble. So he told her about Carl. He hadn't talked about this in years. Not in any real way, not to anyone who wasn't there. He told her about the letter he'd written, the one he expected no response to. About arriving in Stuttgart in February with a duffel bag and a level of German that was functional but not fluent, and Carl meeting him at the workshop door and looking him over and saying, in English, "You're smaller than I expected," which was Carl's version of a welcome. About the work. About what it felt like to work on machines that had history. Not just age, but actual, documented, verifiable history. Cars that had been driven in races, by drivers whose names were still spoken with a particular reverence. The weight of that, the responsibility of it, about Carl's philosophy, that the honest work outlasted everything else, that you could cut corners, rush, do adequate work instead of excellent work, and it might not matter for years or decades, but eventually the machine would tell the truth about how it had been built. Victoria listened the way she had in the car, without filling the silences, without shaping the story toward her own reactions, just listening. What happened to his workshop? She asked, when he'd wound down a little. His son sold it after the fire. The tools, the cars in progress. A collector bought most of the inventory. He paused. I heard about it after the fact. I wasn't in contact with him toward the end. By the time he died, I'd been back in the States for 5 years. Sophie was almost 2. He looked at his glass. I always meant to go back. Not to the workshop, just to pay respects. I haven't. She didn't tell him he should. She didn't offer a neat response about grief or intention. She just said, "That's a hard thing to carry." "It is," he said simply. They ate. They talked about other things. About her company. About the specific exhaustion of rebuilding trust publicly. About a board member who had called her the day after everything went public and said, "I knew something was off with Cross 2 years ago," and didn't say anything, and how she'd had to sit with that piece of information and decide what to do with it. "What did you do with it?" Mason asked. I told him that the next time he had that feeling about someone in a professional relationship with me, I expected him to tell me. She paused. I also told him that I appreciated the call because it would have been easier not to make it. That's generous. It was mostly strategic, she said. I need the board functional, but, she tilted her head, maybe a little generous. He smiled. She smiled back, and it was the real version, not the managed one from the terrace, not the relieved one from the car. Just actual. The smile of someone who was having dinner with a person they liked. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't make it a moment. He just let it be what it was. He got home at 10:30 to find Mrs. Kowalski asleep in the armchair and Sophie asleep on the couch. A blanket pulled up to her chin, the stuffed elephant Gerald tucked under one arm. The television was on low, some nature documentary about ocean migration that neither of them had been watching for some time. He turned it off. He stood in the quiet of the small apartment and looked at Sophie for a moment, the way her face went completely slack in sleep, the particular quality of peace that kids had, the whole body conviction of it. Mrs. Kowalski stirred. She looked at him, then at the clock, then at him again. Good? She said quietly. Yeah, he said. Good. She nodded, collected herself, patted his arm once with the unsentimental affection of someone who showed things in small gestures, and went home. Mason picked Sophie up carefully. She half woke, enough to say, "Hi, Dad," and immediately go back under, and carried her to her bed. He tucked the blanket around her and put Gerald back in her arm and stood up. His phone was on the kitchen counter. He picked it up and saw a message from Victoria, sent 20 minutes ago. "I had a really nice time. Thank you for telling me about Carl." He stood in the kitchen in the late-night quiet of the apartment, the street below making its small, ambient sounds, and typed back, "Me too. First time I've talked about him in a long time. It was good." He put the phone down and stood for a moment. Then he went to bed and slept better than he had in weeks. The court date got pushed, as Ruth had predicted it might. Damien's defense team filed a series of pretrial motions, challenges to evidence admissibility, requests for continuances, the procedural machinery of attorneys who were running out of options and using process as a delay tactic. Mason followed it in the case updates Ruth sent him, reading them with the same patient attention he gave technical manuals, carefully, without impatience, looking for what mattered and ignoring what didn't. I was called into Ruth's office in December for a full preparation session, 3 hours walking through his testimony. The questions Marsh would ask, the questions the defense would ask, how to handle misdirection, how to answer only what was asked without volunteering more, how to stay calm when someone in a suit was trying to make him feel uncertain about things he was entirely certain about. "When they question your identification of Carl's modification," Ruth said, "they will try to make it sound like you're guessing. They will use words like subjective and speculative and anecdotal experience. How do you respond?" "I describe the modification technically," Mason said. "I explain each specific component, the cooling system adjustment, the oil routing, the throttle linkage modification. And I explain why each one is non-standard and why they appear together in a specific configuration that is not documented in any factory manual or published restoration guide. Then I explain that I observed this configuration firsthand in Carl Reinhardt's workshop and in no other context. That's not speculation. That's direct knowledge." Ruth looked at him over her glasses. "Good. You can call a technical expert if you want corroboration. I can give you 3 names, people who knew Carl's work, 2 in the US and 1 in Hamburg. Any of them would recognize the modification." "Already in the works," she said. "But your testimony establishes the chain of discovery. That's what matters most." She paused. "You're going to be fine on the stand, Mason. You're the calmest witness I've prepared in 15 years. I just answer what's true," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's why you're the calmest witness I've prepared in 15 years. Christmas came the way it always did, more abruptly than it should, despite being scheduled. Sophie had opinions about the tree and implemented them with a confidence that Mason respected even when it resulted in a significant portion of the ornaments being clustered on the lower left quadrant because she could reach there and the aesthetic unevenness didn't bother her at all. He added some to the upper sections when she was in bed one night, and she noticed immediately the next morning and gave him a look of deep betrayal before deciding the additional ornaments were acceptable, since he'd kept the pine cone she'd made in kindergarten at the very top. Mrs. Kowalski came for Christmas Eve dinner. Mason made his mother's pot roast recipe, which he'd made every Christmas Eve since he was 25, not because it was anything spectacular, but because it was the right smell for that time of year, the smell of his childhood kitchen. And some things you keep not because they're perfect, but because they're yours. He talked to Victoria on Christmas morning. She was in the Berkshires at her mother's house, something she'd said her mother had requested with an uncharacteristic vulnerability that had made her impossible to say no to. He called to say Merry Christmas, and they talked for 40 minutes, which was both longer than necessary and not quite long enough. "I have a question," she said somewhere in the middle. "Okay. When this is over, the trial, all of it, what do you want?" He considered the question. It wasn't the kind of question people asked him very often. Most people assumed they knew, or assumed the answer was the same as everyone else's, or didn't ask because they were afraid of what the answer might be. "I want Sophie to be okay," he said. "She is, mostly. I want her to keep being okay." "And for you?" He looked out the apartment window at the gray Christmas morning sky, the empty street, the snow that had come in overnight and covered everything in the particular quiet of early morning after a storm. "I want to stop treading water," he said. It came out more honestly than he'd meant it to, which happened sometimes in conversations with her. The honesty was almost involuntary. I've been surviving. I've been good at surviving, but I think... He paused. I think I might want more than that. She was quiet for a moment. I think you should have more than that, she said softly. He didn't know what to do with that exactly, so he held it carefully and changed the subject gently, and she let him, because she understood when a thing had been said and didn't need to be said again. After they hung up, he sat in the kitchen with his cold coffee and looked at Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator, the one that was their garage, that was him and her and the car they were going to race together, and felt the strange, tentative, not entirely safe feeling of someone who was starting, very cautiously, to believe in something beyond the next morning. He didn't trust it completely, but he didn't dismiss it either. He poured the cold coffee out and made a fresh cup and started on Christmas breakfast, and Sophie woke up 15 minutes later at full volume, and the day got going the way days do, imperfect and loud and full of small things that turned out to matter. January in Connecticut was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically. It just settled in and stayed, the way certain kinds of grief did. Not sharp, just constant, present in every surface and every breath, and every morning you had to talk yourself into getting out of bed before the heat came up. Mason ran the garage with the space heater going full blast, and his breath still visible until 10 in the morning. He wore a second flannel under his work jacket and drank too much coffee and got through the days the way he always did. One job at a time, one problem at a time. The satisfying logic of mechanical work, providing its own kind of structure when the world outside didn't. He and Victoria had fallen into something that neither of them had named, which felt right because naming it would have required being certain about it, and neither of them was quite certain yet. They talked on the phone 3 or 4 times a week. She came by the garage twice in January, once with coffee, once without, both times staying for an hour or more, leaning against the workbench while he worked, talking about whatever presented itself. The case, the company, Sophie's ongoing diplomatic situation with a boy in her class named Marcus, who remained, in Sophie's assessment, a persistent problem despite her best efforts. Victoria had laughed at that for a full 30 seconds. What did he do this time, she'd asked. He said her drawing of a car looked like a potato. To be fair, do not finish that sentence, Mason said. She'd laughed again, and he'd found himself thinking that the laugh, real, unguarded, slightly undignified, was one of his favorite things, which was information he filed away carefully and didn't examine too closely yet. They hadn't kissed. They hadn't talked about whether they were going to. There was something that felt almost deliberate about the pace of it, like both of them had been moving too fast through things for too long, and had tacitly agreed, without discussing it, to not rush this particular thing. Sophie had met her properly in the second week of January, when Victoria came by on a Saturday afternoon, and Sophie happened to be in the garage helping, which was what she called it when she sat on the rolling stool and handed Mason tools approximately 40% of the time, and the other 60% talked at him about whatever was on her mind. Victoria had knocked on the open bay door, and Sophie had looked up from the stool and said, with complete directness, "Are you the Porsche lady?" Victoria had looked at Mason. "Am I?" "Apparently," he said. "Then yes," Victoria told Sophie. "I'm the Porsche lady." Sophie had considered her with the focused assessment of a 6-year-old conducting a serious evaluation. "Dad fixed your car," Sophie said. "He did, really well." "I know, he's the best mechanic." This was not pride so much as a statement of fact, the way you might say water is wet. "Do you want to see the other cars?" And just like that, Sophie had given Victoria a tour of the garage, every car currently in the bay, each one described with a mixture of accurate technical detail she'd absorbed from Mason over years and completely invented context she felt added narrative value. The Chevy Tahoe needed new everything because it was sad. The Honda Civic had a very complicated heart situation, which was Sophie's interpretation of Mason saying the timing belt was worn. Victoria had followed the tour with complete seriousness, asking questions and accepting the answers with the attentiveness of someone who understood that being taken seriously by a child was its own kind of gift. Afterward, when Sophie had gone upstairs to get something, and they were briefly alone in the garage, Victoria had looked at Mason with an expression he couldn't fully decode. "She's extraordinary," she said quietly. "She really is," he said. "She's also a complete menace, just so you have the full picture." "The two aren't mutually exclusive." "No," he agreed. "They really aren't." February brought the plea arrangement Ruth had predicted. Damian Cross's defense team had been working the angles for months, filing motions, requesting continuances, testing the edges of the evidence for any place soft enough to push through. They hadn't found one. The forensic accountant's report was thorough to the point of being almost architectural in its detail, mapping 11 years of financial manipulation with a precision that left almost no interpretive room. The provenance records on the Porsche was verified by 2 independent document examiners who confirmed Carl Reinhardt's handwriting in the letter. The technical expert Mason had suggested, a restoration specialist named Werner Haas, who had known Carl and worked adjacent to his methods for 15 years, had submitted a 14-page analysis of the engine modification that was, in Diane Marsh's words, definitive. Damian Cross pleaded guilty to federal securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy in the second week of February. He pleaded guilty to the witness tampering charge separately, in the same session. Ruth called Mason at 7 in the morning. "It's done," she said. "He entered the plea an hour ago. Sentencing is scheduled for April." Mason was standing at the stove making Sophie's oatmeal. He turned the heat down slightly. "Okay," he said. "You're still on the witness list for sentencing if the prosecution decides to call you, but there won't be a trial." "I understand." "Mason." Her voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly. Ruth Calloway didn't do soft, but more direct. "You should know that your testimony, the documentation, the letter, it mattered. Not just procedurally. The timeline it established, the proof of intent going back to when Carl worked on that car. It made this case airtight in ways that a financial fraud case rarely is. Marsh said as much." He stirred the oatmeal. "Carl made it airtight," he said. "I just found it." "You knew what you were looking at," she said. "That's not nothing." He thought about Carl's workshop in February. The cold that came off the stone floor and the smell of oil and metal and the German radio station Carl always had on low, playing jazz. He thought about a particular afternoon when he'd made a mistake on a carburetor rebuild, and Carl had looked at it for a long time without saying anything and then said very quietly, "Do it again. But this time believe the first thing your hands tell you, not the second thing your head tells you." "No," he said. "It's not nothing." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair catastrophic. "Is the oatmeal done?" 2 minutes. She sat at the table and put her chin in her hands and stared at the bowl with the patience of someone who had accepted the universe's timeline, but wanted it noted that she was waiting. "Ruth," Mason said into the phone, "thanks for everything. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see my bill." But she said it warmly, and he understood it was her version of "you're welcome," and hung up. He told Victoria about the plea that evening, and she was quieter than he expected. Not upset, more processing. He could hear it in the pauses. "I thought I'd feel more," she said. "Relief. Something definitive. But it mostly just feels like an ending that's been coming so long it lost most of its momentum." "That's probably normal," Mason said. "The significant moment happened months ago when you found out. This is just the paperwork catching up." "Is that how it felt when you found the letter? Like the significant moment?" He thought about sitting in the garage on that shop stool with Carl's envelope in his hands, reading the German in his head, feeling the weight of it. "No," he said honestly. "When I found it, I felt something closer to obligation, like something had been handed to me and I had to figure out what to do with it." He paused. "The significant moment was probably when Damian came to the shop and mentioned Sophie. That was when it became personal enough that I understood I was going to see it through no matter what." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry that happened," she said. "I know you are." He leaned back in his chair. "Stop apologizing for it. It worked out." "Very impossible to apologize to." "I prefer to think of it as efficient." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "How's Sophie?" "She made me watch a 40-minute documentary about dolphins tonight. It was her homework, but she had questions beyond the scope of the assignment." "What kind of questions?" "Whether dolphins had best friends. Whether dolphin best friends stayed best friends their whole lives. Whether I thought Gerald the elephant was her best friend, or more of a companion, and what was the difference." "What did you say?" "I said Gerald was a companion in the truest sense, reliable, consistent, present, and that her best friend was probably Emma from down the street, but that the 2 categories weren't competitive." "That's a very thoughtful answer." "It took me a minute." He smiled. She seemed satisfied. She fell asleep before the documentary was over, so I watched the last 20 minutes alone. Did dolphins have best friends? Apparently they have long-term social bonds that show preference patterns consistent with friendship. So yes, functionally. Now I want to watch the documentary. I'll send you the link. She laughed then. Real, the good kind. And he sat in the quiet of the apartment after Sophie was asleep and talked to this woman for another hour about nothing much and everything a little, and thought about what he'd said to her on Christmas morning. I think I might want more than that. He was starting to believe it. The journal arrived on a Thursday in March. He came home from the garage in the late afternoon to find a package on the doorstep. A flat, padded envelope, his name written on it by hand. He recognized the handwriting, Victoria's. He'd seen it in text messages where she'd photographed handwritten notes because she thought faster in pen than keyboard. He took it inside and opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a leather-bound journal, old but carefully preserved. The leather deep brown and worn at the corners, the binding tight, the pages yellowed at the edges but intact. On the inside front cover, in the cramped particular script he would have recognized anywhere, was a name and a date. Karl Reinhardt, Stuttgart, 1987. Mason sat very still for a moment. He turned the pages slowly. The journal was written in German, which he could read, slowly, with some effort on the more technical passages, but read. It was a workshop journal, the kind Karl kept for every significant project. Records of work done, notes on problems encountered, observations about the machines themselves that went beyond technical documentation into something closer to character study. Karl had always believed that a car, like a person, had a specific nature that you had to understand before you could help it properly. The entries spanned 2 years. There were sketches, Karl's hand drawings of engine configurations, of modification approaches he was testing, of solutions to problems he was working through. Mason recognized some of the configurations. He recognized the sketch of the cooling modification. There it was, 3/4 of the way through the journal, laid out in Karl's precise hand with annotations in the margins. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning pages, reading slowly, translating in his head. At the back of the journal, folded and tucked inside the rear cover, was a handwritten note. In English, this time. Mason, I found this through a contact of Werner Haas, who reached out after submitting his technical analysis. It was sold with a collection in 2010 and has been sitting in a private archive in Hamburg since. Werner thought you should have it. I thought so too. He read the note twice. Then he looked at the journal in his hands. This record of Karl's mind at work, the actual thought process behind the modification that had been sitting inside a car for a decade and a half. The private working notes of a man who'd shaped Mason's understanding of what it meant to build something with integrity. He sat with it for a long time. Sophie came home from a play date at Emma's to find him still at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of him. What's that? She asked, dropping her backpack in the wrong place, which he didn't correct right now. A book that belonged to someone who taught me things, he said. She came and looked at it over his shoulder. It's in a different language. German. Can you read it? Slowly. She looked at the sketch on the open page, the engine diagram, Karl's annotations surrounding it. It looks like your drawings, she said, when you explain stuff to me. He looked at the diagram and thought about the 100 times he'd sketched out an engine problem on the back of an envelope to explain it to a customer, or to Sophie, or to himself when he was thinking through something complicated. He taught me that too, Mason said. Draw the problem. It helps you see it. Sophie studied the sketch for another moment, then straightened up and retrieved her backpack from the wrong place and put it in the right place, which he appreciated. Is he the one who wrote the letter? In the Porsche? He told her some version of what had happened, simplified, appropriate for 6, without the fraud or the federal charges, just that he'd found something hidden in a car that had helped someone. Yes, he said. She thought about this. Was he a good person? Mason considered the question in its full weight. Karl had been difficult, impatient with imprecision, caustic when he was tired. He'd had a relationship with his adult children that Mason had observed from a distance as complicated at best. And he'd been the kind of person who gave his best energy to his work and sometimes left the people around him with what was left over. He hadn't been simple or easy or uncomplicated, but he'd built things honestly. He'd hidden a letter in a car because he couldn't do nothing. He'd put his best work into a machine regardless of what was happening around it. He was a person who tried to do good work, Mason said, even when it was hard. Sophie processed this with the philosophical seriousness she brought to certain questions. That's what you do, she said. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without intending it to land. And then she went to get a snack because she was 6 and thinking about what to eat was immediately more pressing. Mason sat with the journal and the weight of what she'd said, which settled into him quietly and stayed. He called Victoria that night. Did you get it? She asked, before he'd said anything. I got it. Victoria, Werner found it. I just paid the archive fee and arranged shipping. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Mason. Her voice was quiet. I know what Carl meant to you. I've known since the first time you talked about Stuttgart, and I know you've carried the fact that you never went back, never paid respects, whatever the right word is. I can't give you the time back, but I could give you this. He didn't have an immediate answer for that. Thank you, he said finally. It came out inadequate for what he meant, but she understood the inadequacy, which was its own form of understanding. Werner said the journal has some of Carl's most detailed notes on the modification, she said. He was excited about it from a historical perspective. He wants to write a monograph at some point, if you'd be open to contributing. I'd be open to that. Good. A pause. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about, something Werner mentioned when we were in contact. She paused again, and this pause had a different quality, something slightly careful in it, like a person approaching something they weren't sure how to hand over. What? He said. There's a program, she said, in England, the Ashworth Classic Restoration Institute. It's connected to a racing museum outside of Oxford. They run a 2-year residency for master-level restoration specialists. The work they do it's the highest tier, Mason. Cars with race pedigree, significant automotive history. Werner did a semester there in 2018. He said it's the closest thing existing to what Carl's workshop was. Mason was quiet. Werner submitted your name, Victoria said. He sent them your documentation of the Porsche modification, his technical analysis referencing your identification, a letter about your training under Carl. The program director contacted me last week. They want to speak with you. He sat with that for a moment that stretched longer than he expected. Victoria, he said, I know what you're going to say. Sophie is 7 in April. I run a garage in Stamford. I can't move to England for 2 years. The program has a family housing option, she said, and the precision of it, the fact that she'd already looked into this, already anticipated this exact objection, told him she'd been thinking about it more carefully than the casual introduction suggested. It's a residency, not a relocation. The housing is on site. There's a school 3 miles away that's excellent. And she stopped herself. And what? And you told me on Christmas that you wanted to stop treading water. Her voice was steady. I've been thinking about that. I don't think you said it as a throwaway thing. I think you meant it. He got up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The March night was cold and the street lights made yellow circles on the wet pavement. What's your interest in this? He said. Directly, she didn't hesitate. I care about what happens to you, both in the way that I care about you as a person I've come to. She paused, rearranging. And in the practical sense that you did something extraordinary for me, and I would like to do something for you that's actually proportionate to that. And I'm aware those two things are tangled together, which is probably relevant information. He stood at the window. I have a garage, he said. You have a garage that you own, which means you can also close it temporarily, or find someone to manage it, or I'm not closing the garage. I know, I'm not asking you to. A pause. I'm asking you to talk to them. 1 phone call, that's all. He looked at the street, at the ordinary Stamford block he'd looked at for years, the hardware store on the corner, the maple tree that dropped its seeds in the gutter every fall and clogged the drain until he cleared them, the upstairs window of the building across the street, where an older man who he'd never actually met grew tomatoes in a window box every summer. He thought about Stuttgart, about arriving with a duffel bag and bad German and more hope than preparation, about the smell of Carl's workshop on a cold February morning, about 14 months of learning that the work itself had a kind of integrity that existed separate from everything else, separate from money, from circumstance, from the particular accidents of where you ended up. I thought about what Carl had written in the margin of a technical manual once, next to a diagram of a fuel system. Mason had stared at it for so long he'd memorized it without meaning to. The point is not to fix the broken thing. The point is to understand it well enough that it tells you how it wants to be whole. One phone call, he said. He heard the breath she let out. Not dramatic, just the small involuntary release of someone who had been holding something carefully. One phone call, she confirmed. Ata. He talked to Sophie about it on a Saturday morning, which was when they had their serious conversations, never weeknights, when homework and routine and the logistics of regular life didn't leave room for anything that required full attention. Saturday mornings, with nowhere to be and cartoons available as a consolation prize if the conversation went poorly. He mud pancakes. He let her put too much syrup on them, which he usually rationed. She looked at the excess syrup with the satisfied expression of someone who understood that unusual permissiveness indicated something important was coming. Dad, she said, what's happening? What makes you think something's happening? You made pancakes and you let me have the syrup. She pointed at the bottle. You always say 1 tablespoon. I say try to use 1 tablespoon. It's a guideline. It's a rule and you know it. She ate a bite. What's happening? So he told her. He explained the program in terms she could understand. A school, basically, for people who fixed very important old cars. In England. For 2 years. Sophie ate her pancakes and listened without interrupting, which was unusual and indicated she was thinking seriously. Would we live there? She said. That's what I'm trying to figure out. They have houses for the families of the people in the program. Would I go to school there? Yes, there's a school nearby. Would Mrs. Kowalski come? He hadn't thought about that. Mrs. Kowalski lives here, he said. But we'd come back. It's not permanent. Sophie chewed. Her expression was hard to read. The particular focused interior expression of a child working through something complicated and not ready to report on it yet. Do you want to do it? She asked finally. He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table, with her too much syrup pancakes and her serious face, and her stuffed elephant sitting on the empty chair beside her because she'd brought Gerald down to breakfast for reasons she hadn't explained. I think I might, he said honestly. I think it might be. An important thing. For me. For the work I can do. He paused. But not if it's wrong for you. That matters more. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Does Victoria know about this? She's the one who told me about it, actually. Sophie considered this piece of information. Does she know about England? She's been to England, Mason said carefully. No, I mean, is she coming? Sophie asked it the way she asked most complicated questions, directly, without embarrassment, because she hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by the obvious questions. Mason looked at her. He hadn't asked Victoria that. They hadn't talked about that. There was a significant amount they hadn't talked about yet, in the careful way of 2 people who were being deliberate. I don't know, he said honestly. Sophie ate another bite of pancake and appeared to file this information in whatever system she used to organize the world. I think you should ask her, she said. You do? Yes. She looked at Gerald on the chair. Gerald thinks so too. Gerald has opinions now? Gerald has always had opinions. You just haven't been listening. She slid off her chair with the empty plate. Can I watch cartoons? 30 minutes. 45. 35. Fine. She took her plate to the sink, which he'd been training her to do for 2 years, and went to the couch. And he sat at the kitchen table with the pancake syrup and his coffee and the particular noise of Saturday morning cartoons, and thought about what his 7-year-old and a stuffed elephant had just, between them, told him to do. He drove to the estate on a Sunday afternoon in late March. He hadn't called ahead. He thought about it and decided that calling ahead would mean choosing words in advance, which was the kind of thing he did when he was performing a version of what he meant rather than just meaning it. The gate code was the same. He'd half expected it wouldn't be, but it opened immediately, and he drove the long driveway in his truck and parked by the front steps and walked up. Victoria answered the door herself. She was in a sweater and jeans, reading glasses on her head, a pen in her hand that suggested she'd been working at something. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was surprised, but not unpleasantly surprised, which was its own form of answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. Mason. Sorry I didn't call. It's fine. She stepped back to let him in. Is everything okay? Yeah. He stepped inside. The house was quiet, weekend quiet, empty of the assistants and executives that populated it on weekdays. I had a conversation with Sophie. About the program? Sort of. He stood in the entryway. He He wasn't going to make a speech about this. He wasn't going to arrange it carefully. He was just going to say it. She asked if you were coming, he said, to England. If that's something we were... He stopped, started more directly. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, not Mason. Not in the way that you think I want to hear it, because I'd rather Mason. She said his name again, and the second time it was quieter, and she took the 2 steps across the entryway that closed the distance between them and looked at him with the directness that was one of the things he most... She kissed him, not dramatically, not with the cinematic precision of a staged thing. She kissed him the way you kiss someone when you've been thinking about it for a long time and you've run out of patience for continuing to not do it, and it was slightly off-center at first because they were both slightly off balance, and then it wasn't. When they separated, she looked at him. I've been waiting for you to do that for 3 months, she said. I finally gave up waiting. I was being careful, he said. I know. She looked at him with something exasperated and fond simultaneously. You're very careful. It's one of your best qualities. It's also, occasionally, deeply aggravating. Sophie said I should ask you. I like Sophie enormously. She said Gerald agreed. Victoria laughed. The real one. The good one. What did you want to ask me? He looked at her. At the person who had stood beside a broken Porsche 3 months ago and laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, and who had stood in his garage in a dark sweater asking careful questions, and who had sent him a dead man's journal because she understood, without being told in complete sentences, what it would mean. I was going to ask if you'd want to come, he said, to England, if this program happens. I know you have... He gestured vaguely at the house, the company, the entire architecture of her life. I know it's not practical. I just wanted to ask, because Sophie was right. Victoria leaned against the doorframe and looked at him steadily. My company has a London office, she said. I've been thinking about spending more time there for business reasons that have nothing to do with you. A pause. Oxford is not far from London. No, he said, it's not. England has good schools. So I've heard. She looked at him for another moment. You understand that this is... We're not... I know what it is, he said. I'm not asking you to plan the next 20 years. I'm asking if you want to be part of what's next. The afternoon light came through the window beside the door and caught the dust motes in the quiet of the house in Victoria's face, which was doing something he recognized now as her processing expression. The moment before she said something she actually meant. Yes, she said. I want to be part of what's next. He nodded. She looked at him. Are you going to do something now, or are you going to be careful again? He almost smiled. He reached out and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the pen, and held it, and that was enough for right now. It was enough for the moment they were actually in, which didn't need to be more than it was. I called the program director, he said, Friday morning. She looked at him. You didn't tell me. I wanted to see if it was real first. And they want me to come in April, for an evaluation visit. To look at the facility, meet the team, bring my documentation. He paused. They said what Werner submitted was... He looked for the right word. They called it exceptional. The documentation, the technical analysis, the history with Carl. He paused. They knew Carl. The director did. He was quiet for a long time when I mentioned the modification. Victoria watched his face. Are you going to do it? She asked. He thought about Carl's workshop. About arriving young and uncertain with a duffel bag, about the 14 months that had shaped the most important things he knew how to do. He thought about Sophie at the kitchen table with too much syrup and a stuffed elephant's proxy vote. He thought about what Carl wrote in the margin of a manual, years before Mason had been old enough to understand it fully. The point is not to fix the broken thing. The point is to understand it well enough that it tells you how it wants to be whole. Yeah, he said. I think I'm going to do it. Victoria squeezed his hand once. They stood in the quiet of the entryway for a moment, not saying anything. Outside, through the tall windows, the late March trees were beginning to show the first faint suggestion of green. Not quite there yet, just the idea of it, the edge of a change that had already decided to happen. Mason looked at it and didn't try to name what he was feeling, which was large and not simple, and didn't fit neatly into any category he had for things. He just stood with it. That was enough. The sentencing hearing for Damien Cross was on a Tuesday in April, and Mason almost didn't go, who wasn't required to. Diane Marsh had told him weeks earlier that the plea arrangement made his presence unnecessary. The testimony was already in the record. The additional charges had been folded into the sentencing guidelines, and the judge had everything she needed to make a determination. Mason could stay in Stamford, open his garage, fix cars, and learn about the outcome from Ruth's phone call the way he'd learned about most of the case's developments. He went anyway. He didn't explain it to himself in any elaborate way. He just woke up that Tuesday morning and knew he was going. He dropped Sophie at school, told her he had a meeting in New Haven, and drove the 40 minutes on I-95 with the radio off and his coffee in the cup holder. Going cold. The way it always did on drives where he was thinking too hard to drink it. The federal courthouse in New Haven was the kind of building that communicated its seriousness through scale, tall ceilings, stone floors, the acoustic particular to spaces that have witnessed a great deal of consequential things over a long time. Mason sat in the gallery with a handful of other observers, most of whom appeared to be journalists or people connected to Victoria's company. He recognized one of the board members from photographs. He didn't introduce himself. Victoria was there, sitting several rows ahead of him. She didn't know he was coming. He hadn't told her, for the same reason he hadn't called ahead before driving to the estate in March. He wasn't performing anything. He just wanted to be present. She saw him when she turned to speak to Ruth, who was seated beside her. A brief moment of surprise, then something that settled into something else. She nodded once, and he nodded back, and that was sufficient. Damien Cross came in with his attorneys looking like a man who had spent 6 months being slowly reduced. Not dramatically. He still wore the good suit, still held himself with the practiced composure of someone who understood that how you appeared in a room mattered. But something had gone out of him. The particular quality Mason had noticed in Victoria's garage on that second day. The calibrated warmth, the ease that was too precise to be accidental. It was still present in the form, but the engine behind it had quit. He didn't look at the gallery. The judge was a woman in her 60s with white hair and reading glasses and the manner of someone who had stopped being interested in theater approximately 3 decades ago and was here exclusively for facts and decisions. She moved through the proceeding with efficiency and without the performed gravity that Mason had expected. She'd clearly read everything. She asked clarifying questions of both the prosecution and defense that indicated she understood the technical financial details of the case better than most people in the room. When she got to the witness tampering charge, she looked up from the papers in front of her and said, "Mr. Cross, I want to address this specifically. You had been charged with significant federal crimes. You were on bail. And you drove to the home of a fact witness, a man with a 6-year-old daughter, and made statements that any reasonable person would interpret as a threat directed at that child." She paused. "I want to understand what you believed that would accomplish." Damien's attorney began to speak. The judge held up one hand. "I'm asking your client," she said, a long silence. "I was frightened," Damien said. His voice was quieter than Mason remembered it, stripped of the professional finish. "I made a very poor decision." "You did," the judge said. She looked at him for another moment, then looked back at her papers. The sentence was 19 years. Securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy. The core charges carried most of the weight. The witness tampering added to it. The judge cited the duration of the scheme, the number of people whose financial lives had been affected, and the deliberate targeting of a witness's minor child in a manner she described as a calculated attempt to intimidate rather than an impulsive act, which makes it substantially more serious. 19 years. Mason sat in the gallery and listened to the number and felt the weight of it. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief in any simple form. It was more like the feeling at the end of a very long job, when the last component was fitted and the engine turned over and everything worked the way it was supposed to. Not triumph, just the recognition that something had been completed. He thought about Carl hiding that letter. He thought about 10+ years of a fraud that had touched how many people's lives before it was untangled. He thought about the letter tucked behind the interior panel, the yellowed paper, the handwriting in German that said, "For the person who finds what I've done here." Carl never saw this day. He'd put the letter in the car and died 8 years later without knowing if anyone had ever read it. Mason thought that mattered somehow, that Carl had done what he could with what he had and trusted the rest to time and circumstance and the possibility that eventually the right set of eyes would open the right engine bay. There was something in that, not comfort exactly, but a kind of instruction. You did your honest work. You documented what was true. You trusted that the work itself would outlast the moment. He stood when it was over and filed out with the gallery, and walked into the April afternoon outside the courthouse and stood on the steps breathing the cool air. Victoria found him 2 minutes later. She came out with Ruth and the board member, said something brief to both of them, and walked over to where Mason was standing. She didn't say anything for a moment. They stood together looking at the New Haven street, the traffic, the ordinary afternoon happening around the edges of something that had just concluded. 19 years, she said. Yeah. Ruth says he'll likely be out in 13 or 14 with good behavior. She said it without particular feeling, reporting it. Probably, Mason said. Is that... She paused. Is that enough? He thought about it honestly. I don't know what enough would look like, he said. I know it's real. I know it's proportionate to what was established in court. Whether it's enough... He shook his head slightly. I don't think that question has a clean answer. She stood beside him, not touching. They were outside the courthouse. It wasn't the moment for that. Just close enough that the proximity itself said something. Carl would have been satisfied, Mason said. She looked at him. Not happy, he clarified. Happy wasn't really his register, but satisfied. He put the letter in the car because he believed the machine would tell the truth eventually. It did. He paused. I think that would have been enough for him. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You should go to Stuttgart. He looked at her. After Oxford, or before, but at some point. She held his gaze. You've been carrying the fact that you never went back. You said so. And the trial is done, and the journal is yours, and so it's time to close that loop, Mason, for yourself. He didn't argue with it because she wasn't wrong. Maybe, he said. She gave him the look that meant she knew maybe meant yes, but wasn't going to push it. Ruth appeared at Victoria's elbow. We need to get going. The board call is at 3. Victoria nodded. She looked at Mason one more time. The Oxford visit is next week, she said. Tuesday, he confirmed. Call me after. I will. She left with Ruth, and Mason stood on the courthouse steps for another few minutes by himself, hands in his pockets, watching the city move around him and let the morning settle into whatever it was going to be. The Ashworth Classic Restoration Institute sat on the grounds of a converted estate outside Oxford, 40 minutes by train from the city, and then a 10-minute drive through countryside that was doing everything English countryside was supposed to do in April, green and gray and intermittently luminous in the way of places where the sun argues with the clouds all day and occasionally wins. Mason had flown in on a Monday, stayed in a small hotel in Oxford that was comfortable without being fussy, eaten dinner alone at a pub where nobody knew him, and gone to bed early because he didn't sleep well on planes, and his body was not interested in pretending otherwise. He arrived at the Institute on Tuesday morning in a rental car that handled slightly differently than he expected, on roads that went in directions that required active concentration after a lifetime of driving on the other side. The facility itself stopped him when he got out of the car. He'd looked at photographs online, done the reasonable due diligence. But photographs of places like this always missed the quality that made them what they were. The particular combination of age and active use, of history that hadn't been preserved behind glass but was still being worked with, still being handled. 3 stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard, the largest of which had its bay doors open and from which came the unmistakable sounds of serious mechanical work. A smell that hit him immediately, and without warning, oil, metal, old leather, the specific note of engine warmth. It smelled like Carl's workshop. He stood there for a moment with that hitting him. The director was a man named Thomas Ashworth, grandson of the Institute's founder, which explained the name, though he wore the inheritance lightly. He was 50-something, with hands that showed he still worked on the cars himself and didn't just manage others doing it, and he shook Mason's hand with the grip of someone who evaluated people through handshakes, not as a power gesture, but as genuine information gathering. Werner speaks very highly of you, Ashworth said. Werner is generous. Werner is precise. He's not particularly generous. Ashworth looked at him. He said you identified Karl Reinhardt's modification by recognition. Not by research, not by consulting a reference. By recognition. I'd seen it before, Mason said. Where? In Karl's workshop, 1998. Ashworth was quiet for a moment. You trained under Karl. 14 months. Ashworth looked at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. Assessment, recalibration, something that might have been a kind of respect that he wasn't going to express effusively because that wasn't his register. Come, he said. I'll show you what we do here. The tour took 3 hours. Not because the facility was that large, but because Ashworth moved through it the way Carl had moved through his workshop. Not as a guide showing a visitor the highlights, but as a person in full conversation with the space and everything in it, stopping when something was worth stopping for, explaining with the depth that indicated he assumed Mason could follow the depth. The cars were extraordinary. A 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR that had actual race history. Mason stood near it for a long time without touching it. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GT in partial disassembly, its engine components laid out on a white-covered table with the ordered precision of a surgical procedure. A 1948 Cisitalia 202 that Mason recognized from photographs he'd studied years ago. Carl had referenced it as an example of design that understood the relationship between form and mechanical function. And in the back bay, under work, by a young woman who moved around it with the focused competence of someone who had been doing this long enough that the motions were instinctive. A 1969 Porsche 908. Mason stopped. Ashworth stopped beside him. Race history? Mason said. 12 hours of Sebring, 1969. 5th overall. The original driver's name is documented. The engine was rebuilt at some point in the 80s by parties unknown. We're trying to establish whether the rebuild was sympathetic to the original spec or a departure. Ashworth paused. Werner said your documentation work on the Langford Porsche was unusually thorough. I document what I find, Mason said. Most people document what they're looking for, Ashworth said. It's a different orientation. He looked at the 908. The first year of the residency is primarily documentation and analysis. Existing cars, establishing provenance, building the historical record. The second year is restoration proper, working on the cars themselves, under supervision initially and then with increasing autonomy. He paused. It's exacting work. It requires patience that most people don't have. I know, Mason said. Ashworth looked at him. Yes, he said. I imagine you do. They talked for another hour in Ashworth's office. A room that looked exactly like the office of a man who cared about cars and history and almost nothing else, which Mason found comfortable in a specific way. Bookshelves organized by subject rather than aesthetics. Technical manuals stacked alongside historical texts. A photograph on the desk that showed a younger Ashworth with an older man Mason didn't recognize, both of them standing next to a car that Mason eventually identified as a Bugatti Type 35. Ashworth talked about the program structure. The cohort of 4 or 5 residents per year, the visiting experts who came through to work on specific projects, the relationship with the racing museum that funded part of the operation and provided access to cars and archives that weren't available anywhere else. He talked about Carl, not at length, just enough to indicate that Carl was known here, that his reputation had outlasted him, that the work he'd done in Stuttgart in the 80s and 90s was still referenced by people who cared about this particular corner of automotive history. He trained you well, Ashworth said. Based on the documentation Werner sent, the way you mapped the modification, the methodology is recognizable. He had a specific way of approaching an unfamiliar configuration. Start with what can't have been accidental, then work backward to intent. He called it reading the decision, Mason said, not reading the result, reading what the person who built it decided and why. Ashworth looked at him steadily. Yes, exactly. He paused. Will you accept the residence if it's offered? That depends on what the offer looks like, Mason said. I have a daughter. I have a garage in Connecticut that I'm not abandoning. I need the housing situation to be real, not theoretical. The housing is real. 3-bedroom unit on the grounds. The school in the village has had families from the program before. Ashworth pulled a folder from his desk. These are the details. Take them, read them, take the time you need. Mason took the folder. One more question, Ashworth said. Okay, why did you come back? To mechanical work, I mean. You trained under Carl Reinhardt at the level you did. That's not a path that ends in a small garage in Connecticut. Something brought you home. Something kept you there. He wasn't pressing, wasn't judging, just asking the way people who understand craft ask about the detours. Mason thought about Elena. About coming home on a Tuesday in February and finding a voicemail from her doctor, and knowing from the tone of it before he'd heard the words that the news was the kind that reorganized everything. "My wife got sick," he said. "I came home. She died. I had a 2-year-old. He paused. "The garage was what I could do without leaving Sophie, so that's what I did." Ashworth nodded. No elaboration, no condolence performance. Just the acknowledgement of a man who understood that some explanations were complete in their plainness. "And now?" he said. Mason looked at the folder in his hands. "Now Sophie's 7, he said, "and she told me that Gerald thinks I should try." Ashworth looked at him. "Gerald is her stuffed elephant," Mason said. A pause. Then Ashworth smiled, brief, real, the smile of a man who didn't do it often and meant it when he did. "Well," he said, "I'd hate to disagree with Gerald." "What?" He called Victoria from the car in the Institute's parking lot, still in the gravel drive with the stone buildings behind him, and the English afternoon doing its complicated light thing through the clouds. She picked up on the second ring. "How was it?" "It's real," he said. "The work is real. The cars are real. Ashworth he's the real thing." "Did they offer you the residency?" "He said if it's offered, so that means the decision is still formally pending on their end, but—" He paused. "Yeah, I think it's going to be offered." A beat of silence that had warmth in it. "Mason." "I know." "Are you going to take it?" He looked at the building, at the open bay doors, at the particular quality of a place that had been doing important work quietly for a long time without requiring anyone to know about it. "Yes," he said. She exhaled, not dramatically, just the small release of someone who had been waiting for a thing to land. "Sophie's going to need a new coat," she said. "English April is colder than Connecticut April. She's going to tell me it's too puffy. Buy her the puffy one anyway." "I always do." He sat in the parking lot for another few minutes after they hung up, not quite ready to drive yet. He thought about the folder on the passenger seat. He thought about the 908 in the back bay, with its undocumented engine rebuild waiting for someone patient enough to read the decisions embedded in it. He thought about Carl's journal on his bedside table at the hotel, where he'd been reading a few pages each night before sleep, slowly working through the German, finding in the margins the annotations of a mind he recognized. Not because Carl and Mason were alike in every way, but because the particular orientation, start with what can't have been accidental, then work backward to intent, that had become Mason's own approach without him fully realizing it. The student becomes the method, even when the teacher is gone. He drove back toward Oxford through the green countryside and thought that some things were worth the long way around. Sophie's reaction to the news was characteristically efficient. Mason sat down with her that Saturday. Pancakes again, syrup ration this time because the extraordinary news allowance didn't extend to every conversation, and explained that they were going to England for 2 years, that she would go to a school in a village near Oxford, that they would have a house on the grounds of the Institute, and that they were coming back when it was done. Sophie listened with her serious face. "Will we see Victoria?" she asked. "Victoria has a London office. London isn't far." Sophie absorbed this. "Will we get to ride on a train?" "Many trains." "I want a window seat." "I'll do my best." She thought for another moment. "Can Gerald come?" "Gerald is a stuffed animal. He can go anywhere." She seemed satisfied by this. She picked up her fork. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "That's it? Okay? You said it's only 2 years." She ate a bite. "And you said you want to do it, and Victoria's going to be nearby." She shrugged with the particular economy of a child who has processed a thing and moved on. "I think it sounds okay." He sat across from her and thought about how much of parenting was the humbling discovery that the person you were trying to protect was more resilient than you'd given them credit for. "You're going to miss Mrs. Kowalski," he said. Sophie's face shifted slightly. That one she hadn't fully processed yet. "We can call her," she said. "On the tablet. Every week if you want." "Twice a week," she said. "Deal." She ate her pancakes. Gerald sat on the empty chair. The Saturday morning went about its business. They told Mrs. Kowalski together, which Sophie insisted on, and which turned out to be the right call because Mrs. Kowalski's reaction was to look at Mason for a long moment, then at Sophie, and then to say, "Finally," in a tone that suggested she had been waiting for something like this for considerably longer than any of them, and had frankly given up expecting it. She cried a little, which surprised Mason because he'd never seen her cry in 4 years. She covered it quickly and definitively and pretended it hadn't happened, which he respected entirely. I want video calls, she said, not texts. I don't read texts. Twice a week, Sophie said. We decided. Mrs. Kowalski looked at her. You decided already. We decided, Sophie confirmed. Mrs. Kowalski looked at Mason. He spread his hands. She shook her head at both of them, but not unhappily. The garage took more thought. Mason spent 2 weeks working through the options methodically, the way he worked through a complex diagnosis, without rushing to the answer, following each branch until it either resolved or didn't. He had 3 regular customers who brought him enough ongoing work to constitute a real business relationship. He had the lease on the building, which had 8 months remaining. He had tools that were his and equipment that came with the space. The answer came through Gerald in a roundabout way. Gerald, the actual Gerald, the retired firefighter with the 1969 Chevelle, not the Elephant, had mentioned in passing during the Chevelle job that his nephew was finishing up an automotive technology program in Bridgeport and was looking for a situation. Mason called him, met the nephew, a 24-year-old named Patrick, who was earnest and technically competent and had the particular combination of carefulness and curiosity that Mason recognized as the precondition of real skill, and after 2 conversations offered him a management arrangement. Patrick would run the garage. Mason would maintain ownership. The lease would transfer to a month-to-month basis with the building's owner, who was a pragmatic man and agreed without drama. His 3 core customers met Patrick and approved of him, which was more than Mason had expected, and suggested Patrick's interpersonal skills exceeded his own, which he took as a good sign. The garage would still be there when he came back. That mattered. He hadn't been able to explain to anyone exactly why it mattered this much, not in terms that sounded proportionate to the attachment. But the garage was the thing he'd built with what he had, in the years when what he had was limited by grief and responsibility and the narrowed scope of survival mode. Walking away from it permanently would have meant something he wasn't ready to mean. Walking away temporarily, with the understanding that it would be there, that was different. That was leaving a door open rather than closing one. The last month in Stamford was full in the way of last months. Things to do, things to close out. The administrative texture of a life being reorganized. Sophie's school organized a small goodbye, involving a card signed by her class that she carried rolled up in her backpack for 3 weeks. Mrs. Kowalski made pierogi 4 separate times, each occasion described as the last time, but clearly not meant as such. Patrick came in for 2 weeks of overlap, and Mason showed him the systems, the customers, the particular quirks of the equipment, with the thoroughness of someone handing something over that deserved to be handed over carefully. Victoria came to Stamford twice in that last month. The second time she helped Sophie pack, which Sophie had requested directly and which Mason had not interfered with. He could hear them through the apartment, Sophie explaining the organizational logic of her room, Victoria asking questions that took the logic seriously, occasional disagreements about what needed to come and what could be stored. At one point he heard Sophie say, "Victoria, do you think England has good chalk for drawing on the driveway?" And Victoria say, "I think England has excellent chalk. I'll find out." "Can you find out before we go so I know what to expect?" "I'll look into it tonight." "Thank you." A pause. "You're pretty organized." "I try." "Dad's organized about cars, but not about other things." "I've noticed," Victoria said, and her voice had the warmth in it that it always had when she talked about Mason, in a way that wasn't really about Mason, but was entirely about Mason. He went back to what he was doing and didn't say anything. "Boss." The morning they left, Mason walked through the empty garage one last time. Not because anything was left. He'd been through it twice already, making sure Patrick had everything he needed, making sure nothing important was overlooked. The walkthrough was not practical. It was the other kind. The bays were clean. The tools were organized the way he'd organized them for 14 years, the way his mother had organized her kitchen, the way Carl had organized his workshop. Not for show, but for function, so that when you needed something, your hand knew where to go without having to look. He stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the space. He thought about Elena, who had sat in the car he was working on once, a '92 Honda, 3 months into their relationship, and said, "You talk to the cars," and he'd said, "I do not." And she'd said you were just explaining to that engine why the repair was going to feel better when it was done, and he hadn't had a response to that because she was right. He thought about bringing Sophie home from the hospital, 17 hours after she was born, and sitting in the parked car in front of this building at 3 in the morning, unable to make himself go upstairs because upstairs was real and the car felt like the last safe moment before everything changed irrevocably. He thought about the years of ordinary mornings, opening the bay doors, the smell of the cold air and the oil, and the particular quality of a garage before work starts. He thought about the day Victoria's number had appeared in his phone, his shop number, not his personal cell, which he'd answered expecting a standard inquiry about a repair, and gotten instead the beginning of everything that followed. He turned off the last light. He locked the door. He drove to Sophie's school for the last pickup, and she came out with her backpack and immediately said, "Did you remember the carry-on has the books?" And he said yes. And she said, "And Gerald is in the personal item bag, not the checked luggage, because I said so." And he said yes to that too, and she got in the truck and buckled herself in with the confidence of someone who had been doing it herself since she was 4. "Ready?" he said. She thought about it with genuine consideration. "I think so," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her. 7 years old, serious face, her mother's eyes and his stubborn jaw, the stuffed elephant's ear visible through the mesh of the backpack pocket. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am, young." The flight left in the evening and arrived in the grey English morning, and the drive from Heathrow through the countryside to Oxford was everything England does at dawn in May, soft and damp and intermittently beautiful in a way that felt like it was trying to make a good impression without being obvious about it. Sophie had the window seat, which Mason had secured with some negotiation at check-in. She'd slept for most of the flight and was now awake and looking out at the passing countryside with the focused attention of someone cataloging a new world. "The trees are different," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. "More serious looking." He looked out the window. The English oak and ash moving past in the early light, the hedgerows, the stone walls that had been there longer than the country he'd grown up in. "Yeah," he said, "I can see that." They arrived at the Institute in the morning. Ashworth met them in the courtyard, nodded at Mason, looked at Sophie with the direct assessment he gave everything. "You must be Sophie," he said. "Yes," she said. "Do you have a stuffed animal?" A pause. "I have a dog." "That's similar," she said charitably. Ashworth looked at Mason. "She's 7, Mason said. "Right." Ashworth crouched to Sophie's level. "The village school has a good art program. Your father mentioned you draw." Sophie looked at him with sudden serious interest. "What kind of art?" "All kinds, I believe. You'd know better than me." She considered him for a moment longer, conducting whatever internal evaluation she applied to new adults. "Okay," she said. "That's good." Ashworth straightened up and looked at Mason with an expression that said he understood something now that he hadn't before. "The house is ready," he said. "I'll show you." Victoria arrived on a Friday. Not moving in, she was clear about that, and Mason was clear about it too. And Sophie had been informed that Victoria would visit often and stay sometimes, and that was its own arrangement that didn't need a formal name yet. Sophie had received this information the way she received most information, by processing it thoroughly and then asking a specific practical question, which in this case was whether Victoria would be there for her birthday in June. Mason had said he hoped so. Sophie had said she would ask Victoria directly, which she did, and Victoria had said yes without hesitating, which had apparently satisfied the question completely. Victoria arrived on the Friday afternoon with a rental car and a bag that suggested a long weekend and found Mason in the back bay of the Institute. Ashworth had given him a preliminary orientation with the 908, which Mason had started examining with the same methodical documentation approach he'd used on the Porsche. The same camera, the same notes, the same orientation. Start with what can't have been accidental. She leaned in the bay door and looked at him for a moment before he noticed her. He looked up. "How's the 908?" she said. "Complicated. The 80s rebuild was sympathetic in most respects, but whoever did the crankshaft work made an interesting decision I haven't fully decoded yet." "Interesting good or interesting concerning?" "Interesting neither. Interesting like someone knew something specific and I want to know what they knew." She smiled. "Carl's method." "Carl's method," he agreed. She looked around the bay, the car, the documentation spread on the white-covered table, the organized tools. "It suits you," she said. "This place." "You said that about my garage in Stamford. I meant it both times." She stepped into the bay. Sophie found the chalk situation. Was it satisfactory? She said English chalk is acceptable but not exceptional, which I think means she's reserving judgment. He set down his camera. She's going to be fine here, he said. I know. Victoria stood beside him, looking at the 908. Are you? He thought about it the way he tried to think about most things, honestly, without performing the expected answer. Yeah, he said. I think I'm actually going to be more than fine. She looked at him with the directness he'd come to depend on, the quality that didn't let you get away with incomplete honesty. Okay, she said. She believed him. He believed himself. That evening, the three of them ate dinner in the house on the Institute grounds. A meal that was slightly chaotic because Sophie was still establishing the kitchen's geography and had strong opinions about where things should go, and Victoria had brought wine and also a book about English wildlife she'd found at a shop in Oxford that Sophie immediately claimed and began reading at the table, which was against the rules, but Mason let it go because the rules were new here and needed some time to settle. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep on the couch, with the wildlife book open on her chest, which was where books went to die in their household, and Mason and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the wine and the quiet of a house that was new but was beginning to feel, in the preliminary tentative way of things that take time, like it might become something. I keep thinking about what you said, Victoria said, about Carl, about the honest work outlasting everything else. What about it? She turned her glass in her hands. I spent a lot of years building something and trusting that the work itself was enough. That if the company was genuinely good, the fraud around the edges of it wouldn't define it. She paused. And I think that's mostly true. The company is still there. The people who worked for legitimate reasons are still working. What Damien built is gone. She looked up. But I also think I use that belief as a reason not to look too carefully at things I should have looked at. Yeah, he said. Probably some of both. How do you hold those at the same time? That you did something right and also could have done it better? He thought about Elena, about the years he'd spent turning over the decisions of that period. Had he been present enough? Had he missed things? Had she felt alone? About eventually arriving at the understanding that the answer to most of those questions was yes. And also it didn't erase the genuine effort, the genuine love, the genuine attempt to be what she needed. You just do, he said. You hold both of them, and you don't let either one cancel the other out. The mistake doesn't erase the good work. The good work doesn't excuse the mistake. He paused. You keep both, and you try to be better because of both. She looked at him for a moment. Carl taught you that? She said. No, he said. That one I figured out myself. The house was quiet around them. Outside the windows, the English night was dark and mild, the last of the spring evening light gone, the stars intermittently visible between slow-moving clouds. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep, and the wildlife book slid an inch toward the floor. Neither of them moved to catch it. They just sat with the quiet and the wine and the comfortable weight of where they were. Not at a beginning, not at an end, but somewhere in the honest middle of things, which was where most of real life actually happened. Mason thought about what Carl had written in the margin of that manual. The line he'd memorized without intending to, the line that had been sitting in him for 20 years waiting to mean what it meant now. The point is not to fix the broken thing. The point is to understand it well enough that it tells you how it wants to be whole. He looked at Sophie asleep on the couch. He looked at Victoria across the table. He thought about the Porsche and the letter and a dead man who'd hidden evidence in a car because he believed someone would eventually know what they were looking at. He thought about Carl and Stuttgart and a young man who'd arrived with bad German and too much hope and come back changed in ways he was still, 25 years later, discovering. He thought about Elena, who had loved him imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return, and whose absence had shaped him into a different person than he would have been. Not better or worse, just different, and carrying her in the difference. He thought about a garage in Stamford that would still be there when he came back, and a 908 in the next building that had a story embedded in its crankshaft work that he was going to spend the next several months patiently reading. He thought about all the things he hadn't known he was waiting for, all the roads that had looked like detours and turned out to be the route. He didn't say any of this out loud. He didn't need to. Some things were complete in themselves, in the sitting, in the quiet, in the particular warmth of a kitchen in a new place that was beginning, tentatively and imperfectly, to feel like home. He picked up the wildlife book before it fell. He put it on the table, open to the page Sophie had reached. Outside the window, somewhere in the English dark, something was making its way along its own particular route, unhurried, following whatever logic it had been given. Everything else could wait until morning.